In the days when the world was younger and the gods still walked among mortals, when the ancient forests stretched unbroken from mountain to sea, and the Rhine ran wild and free through lands where only legends dared to tread, a dragon coiled itself around the greatest treasure ever gathered beneath the earth. The beast's scales gleamed like black iron in the eternal darkness of its cavern, and its breath turned stone to ash. But it was not the dragon men feared. It was what the dragon guarded. Mountains of gold caught the flicker of its flame, coins minted by forgotten kings, goblets that once graced the tables of gods, rings of power that could command the loyalty of armies. Every piece bore the stain of blood, for this treasure was born from betrayal and baptized in murder. The dwarf lords who first clawed it from the earth's bones killed their own brothers for the privilege. Kings waded through rivers of their subjects' blood to claim it. Each golden piece remembered every scream, every broken oath, every act of fratricide committed in its name. The horde was patient. It could wait generations for its revenge, but it never forgot and never forgave. They called it the Nibelung treasure, and its curse was elegant in its simplicity. All who possessed it would know glory beyond measure, and doom beyond escape. Among the gold lay artifacts that made mere crowns seem like trinkets. Balmung rested there, a sword forged in the world's youth by masters whose names were lost to time. Its edge never dulled, its point never broke, and it sang with joy when it tasted blood. The blade had been waiting centuries for a hand worthy to wield it. Beside the sword lay a cloak woven from shadows themselves, darker than moonless nights, softer than whispered secrets. Wrapped in its folds, a man could walk unseen among his enemies, could stand at the very shoulder of kings and hear their secret counsel. But the cloak demanded its price. For what man could hide from the world without eventually losing himself? Above this treasure, the dragon dreamed dreams of fire and gold, while far away in the world of sunlight, the threads of fate began weaving the pattern that would bring heroes to glory and doom in equal measure. The great courts of men trembled on the edge of change. In mead halls where warriors boasted of their deeds and bards sang of ancient glories, the old gods still received their sacrifices, but their voices grew fainter each year. From the south came monks in rough brown robes, carrying word of a god who died for love of mortal men, who promised not glory in battle, but peace in eternity. This clash split every heart like a sword blade. Warriors trained from birth in blood and honor found themselves questioning whether vengeance truly served justice. Poets who once sang only of heroic deaths now crafted verses about forgiveness. Kings who ruled by strength of arm alone discovered they must navigate between Christian mercy and pagan tradition, between the old certainties crumbling beneath their feet and new truths not yet firmly rooted. The Rhine flowed through it all, eternal witness to the rise and fall of kingdoms. The river had borne funeral barges of heroes and warships of conquerors, had reflected the faces of lovers meeting for the first time and enemies meeting for the last. In its depths swam creatures that had never known sunlight, and in its currents flowed secrets that would outlast all the realms of men. The river remembered everything and judged nothing. It flowed past the great fortress of Worms where Burgundian kings held court, past lonely towers where hermit monks kept their vigils, past sacred groves where the old gods still tasted blood and gold. It had flowed thus for countless ages, and would flow when all our tales' actors returned to dust, when their kingdoms became less than legends whispered by dying firelight. But that ending lay far ahead, beyond betrayal and murder, beyond revenge and the final accounting when all debts would be paid in full. Now, in this moment between heartbeats, between one age and another, Somewhere a young prince dreamed of dragon slaying. Somewhere a queen nursed wounds that would never heal. Somewhere a warrior sharpened his blade and pondered the true meaning of honor. Deep beneath the earth, coiled around its golden hoard, the dragon stirred in its sleep. Fire flickered behind its closed lids as it dreamed of the hero who would come to claim both treasure and doom. The beast could smell him on the wind, young blood, hot with ambition, burning with the need to carve his name into legend. The dragon smiled in its sleep, if dragons can smile. Soon, very soon, the wheel would begin to turn. In the kingdom of Xanten, a prince had grown tired of peace. Siegfried, son of King Siegmund, paced the walls of his father's castle like a caged wolf, watching the Rhine flow past, carrying merchants and pilgrims and wandering warriors, all bound for adventures he could only dream about. The court poets sang of his grandfather's battles, of uncles who had died gloriously in foreign wars, of cousins who had won honor in distant lands. But what songs would they sing of Siegfried? What legends would bear his name? He was 19 years old, trained in sword and spear and strategy, educated by the finest tutors, beloved by his people, and dying of boredom in a kingdom too peaceful for glory. The dragon in its cavern felt the young man's restlessness like heat from a forge. It stretched one great claw and scraped the stone, sending echoes through the darkness. The wheel of fate began to turn. The prince's restlessness had been building for months, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Every morning, he woke to the same pristine walls, the same peaceful courtyards, the same faces that had watched him grow from boy to man. His father's kingdom stretched green and prosperous along the Rhine, blessed with fertile fields and fat cattle, defended by walls that had never seen siege, ruled by laws that kept perfect order. It was everything a prince should want, and everything a hero could not bear. "You have duties here," King Siegmund reminded him over their morning meal, watching his son push food around his plate with the distraction of a man whose mind had already left the room. "The people look to you for leadership. One day, this kingdom will be yours." "One day," the young man muttered, stabbing at a piece of meat. "But what will I have done to earn it? What songs will they sing of the prince who inherited peace and kept it?" Queen Sieglinde looked up from her embroidery, her needle catching the morning light. "Peace is not a curse, my son. Your grandfather shed enough blood to buy tranquility for 3 generations. Would you throw that away for the sake of ballads?" But the prince was already rising from the table, already moving toward the door, drawn by restlessness he could neither name nor quell. "I would throw it away for the chance to become something more than an echo of greater men." He spent his days in the practice yard, working through sword forms with an intensity that worried his tutors. His blade sang through the air, cutting down imaginary foes with the precision of long training and the fury of suppressed ambition. Sweat carved tracks through the dust on his face as he fought shadows, each strike more savage than the last. "You fight like a man fleeing demons," observed the old smith, watching from the forge door where he'd been tempering blade edges. The prince lowered his sword, breathing hard. "Perhaps because I am." The craftsman was ancient, so old that his beard had turned white as winter snow, so old that his hands bore the scars of 1,000 forgings, so old that he remembered songs from before the Christmen came to change the world. He had served 3 kings of Xanten, had forged weapons for the prince's grandfather and father, and now watched the 3rd generation with eyes that had seen too much. "Come," the old man said, turning back into his forge. "If demons hunt you, Perhaps it's time you learned to hunt them back. The forge was a cathedral of iron and fire, where orange flames danced like spirits, and the ring of hammer on anvil sang hymns older than any church bell. The master smith moved among his tools with the grace of long practice, selecting metal with the care of a physician choosing medicines. Steam hissed as hot iron met cold water, and sparks flew like shooting stars in the smoky darkness. "Your hands know sword work," the craftsman said, watching the young man handle the practice blades. "But do they know the making of swords? Do you understand the soul of the weapon you wield?" Under the old master's guidance, the prince learned the alchemy of steel. He discovered how carbon and iron wed in fire to birth something stronger than either parent, how the forge's breath could make metal sing with life, how a blade properly forged carried the echo of its maker's will. His palms blistered and hardened, his shoulders ached from swinging the great hammer, but with each strike he felt something awakening within him, a kinship with the ancient craft, a connection to the heroes who had wielded such weapons in ages past. But as the months passed and his skill grew, the smith's lessons took a darker turn. Working late into the night when the castle slept, the old craftsman would speak of things beyond the making of mere tools. "There are blades," he whispered over the coal's red glow, "that drink blood as other men drink wine. Swords forged not for war but for legend, weapons that choose their wielders rather than being chosen. I have seen such things, boy. I have touched metal that sang with power beyond any earthly forge." The prince leaned closer, caught by something in the old man's voice. Hunger, perhaps, or an ancient grief. Where? What swords? "The dragon's hoard holds treasures beyond counting," the smith said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Gold, yes, but also artifacts of power that make kings tremble. Balmung rests there, waiting for a hand worthy to claim it. But the price?" He shook his grizzled head. "The price is always higher than men imagine." "What price?" The young man's heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. "Blood," came the simple answer. "Death, the ending of one life to begin another. Fafnir the dragon has guarded that hoard for centuries, growing fat on gold and drunk on power. None who seek the treasure return unchanged, if they return at all." But instead of deterring the prince, these words fell on his ears like sparks on dry tinder. Here was purpose beyond the peaceful walls of Xanten. Here was a chance to prove himself worthy of the songs that would outlive kingdoms. "Tell me of this dragon," he said. The old man's eyes glittered in the firelight, and the prince caught a glimpse of something ancient and cunning lurking behind the weathered features. "Ah, now you ask the right questions. But such knowledge comes with obligation, young lord. Are you prepared for the weight of it?" Through the long winter nights, the master craftsman spoke of the dragon, Fafnir, and the cursed treasure it guarded. He told of the Nibelung brothers who had died fighting over their inheritance, of the gold that remembered every drop of blood spilled for its sake, of the artifacts of power that could reshape the destiny of kingdoms. He described the dragon's lair in the deep forests where sunlight never penetrated, the caverns carved from living rock, the passages that twisted like a madman's dreams. "But understand this," the smith warned, his voice heavy with secrets. "The treasure's curse is not a tale to frighten children. It is real as winter, certain as death. All who possess the gold will know glory, and all will know doom. The question is not whether you can win the hoard, but whether you can bear the price it demands." The prince barely heard the warnings. In his mind, he saw himself standing over the dragon's corpse, Balmung gleaming in his hands, his name carved forever into legend. The peaceful kingdom of Xanten felt like a prison, and every day that passed without action felt like another year stolen from his destiny. Spring came early that year, melting the winter snows and setting the Rhine running high and fast with mountain water. The very air seemed to sing with possibility, and the young man felt his restlessness crystallize into purpose as sharp and clear as a blade fresh from the forge. On a morning when mist rose from the river, like the breath of sleeping gods, he stood before his parents in the great hall and spoke the words that would change everything. "I am leaving," he said simply. "There are deeds waiting to be done, and I will not grow old, wondering what songs might have been sung of me." King Siegmund's face went grey as winter stone. "And where will you go, my son? What deed calls you from your birthright?" The prince's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, to claim what was never offered freely, to win what can only be taken by force, to prove that the son of Xanten is worthy of the name his ancestors bore. He did not speak of dragons or treasure, did not mention the fire that had been building in his chest since the old smith first whispered of legendary swords and cursed gold. But his parents saw the change in him, the way he stood straighter, the way his eyes held the light of a man who had found his purpose. "Then go," Queen Sieglinde whispered, tears marking tracks down her cheeks. "But remember, my son, glory is a cold companion, and legends make poor comfort for those who love you." The prince kissed his mother's hand and clasped his father's shoulder, memorizing their faces against the darkness that was coming. Then he turned and walked toward the door, toward the horse already saddled and waiting, toward the forest path that would lead him to dragonfire and destiny. Behind him, the peaceful kingdom of Xanten continued its gentle rhythms, but the wheel of fate had begun to turn. In his cave, the dragon Fafnir lifted its great head and tasted young blood on the wind, hot with ambition and bright with the need for glory. The hunt had begun. The forest swallowed the young warrior whole. 3 days' ride from Xanten, the world changed. The neat farmlands and ordered roads of his father's kingdom gave way to wilderness that had never known the touch of plough or axe. Ancient oaks stretched their gnarled limbs toward a sky barely visible through the canopy, their trunks so massive that 10 men could not encircle them with joined hands. Moss hung like funeral shrouds from branches that had weathered centuries, and the very air tasted of secrets older than memory. Here, the old gods still held sway. No church bells had ever rung in these depths. No Christian prayers had ever disturbed the pagan silence. This was the domain of wolf and bear, of spirits that danced in moonbeams and powers that stirred when mortals passed. His horse snorted and shied at shadows, sensing things its rider could not see, smelling dangers that had no earthly name. On the 4th day, he found the first signs. Blackened stumps marked where mighty trees had stood, their charred remains reaching toward heaven like the fingers of buried giants. The very ground was glass in places, melted by heat beyond any forge's capability. Bones littered the forest floor, not the clean white bones of natural death, but twisted, warped remnants that spoke of agony beyond imagination. Some were human, others belonged to creatures that had no names in any tongue spoken by civilized men. Fafnir's hunting ground. His horse refused to go further, rearing and whinnying in terror when he tried to urge it forward. Finally, he dismounted and continued on foot, leaving the trembling animal tied to a tree well beyond the scorched perimeter. His sword felt suddenly light in his hand, almost insubstantial, as if it were made of straw rather than steel. What blade forged by mortal hands could pierce scales harder than armor? What weapon crafted in an earthly forge could drink the heart's blood of a creature born from nightmare itself? But doubt was a luxury he could not afford. The old smith's words echoed in his memory. There are blades that drink blood as other men drink wine. Balmung rests there, waiting for a hand worthy to claim it. If he could reach the beast's hoard, if he could claim that legendary sword, then perhaps he might stand a chance against the creature that guarded it. The entrance to the lair yawned before him, like the mouth of hell itself. The cavern stretched deep into the earth, carved from living rock by claws and fire over countless years. The walls bore the scars of the beast's passage, gouges wider than a man's arm, polished smooth by the creature's scales. The air that wafted up from the depths carried the stench of sulfur and something else, something that made his stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. The smell of hoarded death, of riches soaked in blood. He descended into darkness. The cavern twisted and branched, like the roots of some monstrous tree, passages leading off in all directions into black uncertainty. But one path showed clear signs of the worm's passage, the walls worn smooth, the floor polished by the creature's belly. The young man followed this main tunnel deeper and deeper, his torch casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock his courage with every step. The air grew warmer as he descended, then hot, then scorching. Sweat poured down his face and soaked his clothes, but still he pressed on. The walls began to glow with their own light, not the warm yellow of flame, but the sullen red of heated metal. And then, rounding a final bend, he saw it, the serpent's hoard. No ballad could have prepared him for the reality. Gold covered the cavern floor like a frozen sea, coins and cups and crowns piled higher than a man's head. Precious stones caught the hellish light and threw it back in crimson gleams, sapphires and emeralds and rubies the size of a child's fist. Weapons lay scattered throughout the wealth, swords and axes and spears wrought by masters whose names were legend, armor that had protected heroes whose deeds were sung in every hall. And in the center of it all, coiled around the greatest concentration of riches like a serpent around its egg, lay Fafnir itself. The beast was larger than he had dared imagine. Its scales were black as midnight and hard as iron, each one the size of a warrior's shield. Steam rose from its nostrils with each breath, and even in sleep its claws flexed and scraped against the stone. The creature's head alone was larger than a warhorse, and its jaws could have swallowed a grown man whole without effort. But it was the sword that caught and held his attention. Balmung lay within easy reach of the monster's head, its blade gleaming with its own inner light. Even from across the cavern, he could feel the weapon's power, a thrumming in the air like the prelude to thunder, a presence that called to something deep in his warrior's soul. Fafnir's eyes opened. They were pits of molten gold, ancient beyond measure, filled with a malevolent intelligence that had watched empires rise and fall. The great head lifted from the wealth, and when the beast spoke, its voice was the sound of grinding stone and roaring flame. "So," the worm rumbled, "another hero comes to die. How many centuries has it been since the last one? I grow bored with the monotony." The warrior drew his sword, though the gesture felt pitifully inadequate. "I am the son of Xanten, and I have come for what is mine by right of conquest." The serpent's laughter shook dust from the cavern ceiling. "Yours by right, child. I was ancient when your grandfather's grandfather was yet unborn. I have devoured knights and kings, have burned armies to ash and scattered their bones like seeds. What makes you think you can succeed where so many heroes have failed?" "Because I have nothing to lose," he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice, "and everything to gain." The battle began with fire. Fafnir's breath turned the air itself to flame, a torrent of heat that would have melted armor and flesh alike. But the young man was already moving, rolling behind a mound of wealth as the inferno passed overhead. Gold coins scattered like rain as he dove for cover, and the very air shimmered with heat. The beast lunged, its massive bulk moving with shocking speed. Claws scraped against stone, where the warrior had stood a heartbeat before, gouging furrows deep enough to hide a body. He struck back, his sword ringing against the creature's scales like a bell against an anvil. The blade that had seemed so sharp in the practice yards of Xanten barely scratched the monster's hide. Again and again they clashed, the worm's size and power against the man's speed and desperation. The young warrior learned to read the creature's movements, to anticipate the direction of its strikes, to use the beast's own momentum against it. But for all his skill, for all his courage, his mortal blade could not penetrate those iron scales. It was then that he saw his chance. The serpent reared back to breathe fire again, exposing the softer scales of its throat and belly. Without thought, without hesitation, the hero lunged forward. His sword pierced the creature's chest just below the heart, driving deep into flesh that had never known the touch of steel. Fafnir's death scream shook the very foundations of the earth. The beast thrashed in its final agony, claws raking stone to powder, tail lashing with enough force to shatter bone. And then, with a sound like a mountain falling, the creature collapsed amid its horde. For long moments, he could only stand and stare at what he had accomplished. Fafnir, terror of the ancient world, lay dead at his feet. But even as triumph filled his chest, he felt something else. A subtle wrongness, as if the very air had become infected with malevolence. The worm's blood was still flowing, pooling around the creature's massive form, and as he watched, the blood began to steam, to smoke, to give off vapors that made his head spin with strange visions. Without fully understanding why, he began to strip off his clothes. The old smith's words echoed in his memory, the ending of one life to begin another. He stepped into the pool of crimson life. The transformation was agony and ecstasy combined. The blood burned like liquid fire against his skin, yet at the same time it seemed to sink into his very flesh, changing him at levels deeper than bone. He felt his mortality burning away, felt something harder and stronger taking its place. The blood coated every inch of his body, except for one small spot between his shoulder blades, where a linden leaf had drifted down from the cavern ceiling. When he emerged from the crimson pool, he was no longer entirely human. His skin had taken on the faint sheen of serpentine scale, and his eyes held depths that had not been there before. More importantly, he knew with absolute certainty that no mortal weapon could harm him, save in that one small spot the leaf had covered. But it was the sword that truly completed his transformation. Balmung came to his hand as if it had been waiting all his life for this moment. The blade was perfectly balanced, lighter than air, yet harder than diamond. Its edge gleamed with its own inner fire, and when he swung it through the air, it sang, not the simple ring of steel, but something deeper, more complex, like a choir of angels welcoming a soul to paradise, or damning it to hell. The wealth called to him next. Mountains of gold and gems, artifacts of power beyond mortal comprehension. As he gathered the hoard, his hands found objects that hummed with ancient magic. Rings that could command loyalty, cups that could heal any wound, a cloak woven from shadows themselves. But it was as he lifted a particularly fine goblet that he heard the voices. "Brother, brother, why do you take what is ours?" Two figures materialized from the riches themselves, the ghostly forms of the Nibelung brothers, Schilbung and Nibelung, who had died fighting over this very hoard countless years before. Their faces were twisted with avarice and rage, their spectral hands reaching toward wealth they could no longer touch. "You have no claim here," the newly transformed hero said, his voice carrying harmonics that had not been there before. "I won this by strength of arm and courage of heart." "Strength?" Schilbung's shade laughed bitterly. "You think this a matter of strength? The gold chooses its own master, and we died for its love. What makes you think you can escape the same fate?" "Because I know the price," came the reply, "and I accept it willingly." The brothers attacked then, their ghostly weapons striking with the force of living steel. But Balmung was made for such battles, forged in the world's youth to cut through more than mortal flesh. The legendary sword cleaved through their spectral forms like sunlight through mist, and with screams of frustrated rage, the brothers dissolved back into the riches from which they had emerged. But their final words echoed in the cavern long after they had vanished. "The curse follows the gold, young hero. You have won glory, now let us see if you can bear the doom that comes with it." Alone among the wealth, the warrior who was no longer quite mortal began the long task of gathering his prize. Each piece he touched seemed to whisper its own history. The blood spilled for its creation, the lies told for its possession, the lives ended for its sake. The hoard was beautiful beyond description and terrible beyond imagination, a weight of gold and guilt that would crush a lesser man. But he was no longer a lesser man. The serpent's blood had changed him, had given him the strength to bear burdens that would break ordinary mortals. He loaded the riches onto the beast's own sledge, a massive contraption the worm had used to drag its spoils deeper into the cave. As he prepared to leave, one final discovery awaited him. Hidden beneath Fafnir's body was a cloak unlike any garment ever woven, darker than a moonless night, softer than silk, lighter than spider's web. When he wrapped it around his shoulders, he felt himself fading, becoming translucent, then invisible entirely. The cloak of shadows, another tool of legend, another burden of power. The journey back to the surface seemed to take years, though the sun had barely moved in the sky when he finally emerged from the earth's depths. His horse was waiting where he had left it, but the animal shied away from him now, sensing the change that the worm's blood had wrought. No longer would mortal beasts accept him as one of their own. But that was a small price to pay for what he had gained. Balmung at his side, the cloak of shadows on his shoulders, and the greatest wealth in the world at his command. He was no longer merely a royal son of Xanten. He had become something new, something legend would remember long after kingdoms fell to dust. Fafnir was dead. The riches were his. And somewhere to the south, along the banks of the Rhine, destiny waited in the halls of kings. But as he loaded the hoard onto a cart commandeered from a passing merchant, a man who took one look at the blood-stained warrior and fled without waiting for payment, the hero found himself remembering the ghostly brother's final words. "The curse follows the gold." He shrugged off the memory. Curse or no curse, he had won what he came for. Let doom come if it would. He would meet it with Balmung in his hand and serpentine fire in his veins. Behind him, the cavern entrance collapsed with a sound like thunder, sealing the beast's tomb forever. But the wealth was free now, and with it the ancient curse that had slept so long in darkness. The wheel of fate turned faster. The journey south along the Rhine took the transformed hero through lands that seemed smaller now, diminished by what he had become. Villages that had once impressed him with their prosperity now appeared quaint, their wooden walls laughably fragile. Knights who had once seemed formidable rode past with weapons that looked like children's toys compared to Balmung. The blood of Fafnir had changed more than his flesh. It had altered his very perception of the world. But it was when the towers of Worms first appeared on the horizon that he truly understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. The Burgundian fortress rose from the riverbank like a stone mountain, its walls thick enough to withstand any siege, its towers reaching toward heaven with the confidence of kings who had never known defeat. This was no provincial stronghold like the peaceful castle of Xanten. This was the seat of power, where kingdoms rose and fell on the whims of princes, where a single decision could reshape the map of the known world. The gates stood open in the manner of a court confident in its strength, guarded by warriors whose mail gleamed like silver in the afternoon sun. Their spears bore the red boar of Burgundy, and their eyes held the steady gaze of men who had looked death in the face and found it wanting. These were no farmers pressed into service, but professional soldiers who had earned their places through blood and skill. As he approached the gates, his cart laden with carefully concealed wealth, the guards moved to intercept him. Their leader, a grizzled veteran with scars mapping forgotten battles across his face, stepped forward with the measured pace of authority. "Hold, traveller," the sergeant called. "State your name and business in the realm of King Gunther." "I am called the son of Xanten," he replied, choosing his words carefully. The true extent of his transformation, the legendary sword at his side, the supernatural gifts he now possessed, these were secrets best revealed slowly. "I come seeking service in your king's hall, that I might prove my worth among worthy men." The guard's eyes appraised him with professional interest, noting the quality of his arms and armor, the way he sat his horse with the ease of long training. But it was something else that made the man step back slightly, an indefinable presence, a weight of power that pressed against the senses like the approach of a storm. "The king holds court this day," the sergeant said finally. "You may enter, but know that Worms is not a place for the faint of heart. Heroes come here to test themselves, and many find the testing fatal." Beyond the gates lay a city unlike any he had ever seen. Worms sprawled along the Rhine's banks like a jewel set in silver, its streets alive with the commerce of a dozen nations. Merchants from as far as Constantinople hawked silks and spices in languages that sang like exotic music. Warriors bearing the arms of distant kingdoms walked beside priests whose robes marked them as servants of the White Christ. The very air hummed with the energy of a place where power and ambition met in equal measure. The castle itself dominated the city like a crown upon a king's head. Its great hall could house an army, its kitchens could feed a siege, and its armory held weapons enough to equip a dozen kingdoms. But it was the quality of the men who walked its corridors that truly impressed him. These were no soft courtiers, grown fat on peace, but warriors whose scars told stories of distant battles and hard-won victories. In the great hall, King Gunther held court. The monarch sat upon a throne carved from a single piece of black oak, its arms shaped like snarling wolves, its back rising high above his head in silent testament to the power of the Burgundian crown. Gunther himself was a man in his prime, tall and broad-shouldered, with the golden hair and blue eyes of his Germanic blood. His face was handsome in the way of kings, marked by the confidence that came from a lifetime of command. But there was something in his expression, a subtle uncertainty, perhaps, or the shadow of some inner doubt that suggested the crown sat heavier on his brow than it appeared. To the king's right stood his brothers, Gernot and Gisela, both cut from the same noble cloth, but each distinct in his own way. Gernot was the warrior of the family, his hands scarred from sword work, his bearing that of a man who had earned respect through strength of arm. Gisela, the youngest, possessed the quick intelligence of a born diplomat, his eyes constantly moving as he assessed the political currents that flowed through the hall like invisible rivers. But it was the figure standing at Gunther's left hand that commanded the newcomer's immediate attention. The king's champion was a man apart from the others. Where the royal brothers were fair, he was dark. Where they were tall, he was of medium height. Where they carried themselves with the easy confidence of those born to rule, the scarred warrior moved with the predatory grace of a hunting wolf. His face was marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir of some long-ago battle. But it was his eyes that truly set him apart, pale grey orbs that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the secrets that lay buried in men's hearts. This was the realm's most trusted advisor, the sword arm upon which the Burgundian throne rested. Stories of his prowess had spread far beyond the borders of his homeland. It was said he had slain 100 men in single combat, that he could read the future in the flight of ravens, that his loyalty to the royal house was absolute and unbreakable. As the newcomer entered the hall, those pale eyes fixed upon him with an intensity that was almost physical. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the two warriors studied each other across the crowded space, each taking the measure of a potential enemy. The hall continued its normal business around them, petitioners pleading their cases, courtiers whispering their intrigues, servants hurrying about their duties. But between the champion and the visitor, time seemed suspended. It was Gunther who broke the spell. "Visitor," the king called, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "Approach our throne. We would know what brings a warrior of obvious skill to seek service in our court." The young man walked forward with measured steps, noting how the crowd parted before him, sensing the weight of power that clung to him like an invisible cloak. When he reached the foot of the throne, he offered the bow due to a king, respectful but not servile, the salute of one warrior to another. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I am the son of King Siegmund of Xanten, and I come seeking a place among your warriors. I have heard tales of the valor of Burgundian knights, of battles won against impossible odds, of honor upheld even in the face of death. If such stories are true, then this is where I belong." A murmur ran through the hall at the mention of Xanten. The kingdom was well known for its prosperity and the quality of its warriors, and any son of its royal house would be welcomed in most courts. But the champion's expression remained unchanged, his eyes still fixed on the newcomer with that unnerving intensity. "Fine words," Gernot observed from his place beside the throne. "But we have heard many fine words from many fine warriors. What proof do you offer of your skill?" It was the challenge the visitor had been expecting, the test that every warrior faced when seeking service in a foreign court. Without hesitation, he drew Balmung from its sheath. The sword sang as it cleared the scabbard, a note so pure and true that it seemed to resonate in the very stones of the hall. The blade caught the light from the torches and threw it back in patterns that dazzled the eye, and even from a distance the weapon's power was unmistakable. This was no ordinary steel, but something forged in the world's youth by masters whose names were legend. The effect on the court was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Hands moved instinctively to sword hilts. Even the servants paused in their duties to stare at the weapon that had appeared in their midst like a piece of captured starlight. But it was the champion's reaction that mattered most. The scarred warrior's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in his facade of impassive control, and his hand dropped to his own sword hilt. For a heartbeat, violence hung in the air like smoke from a forge. "Peace," Gunther commanded, though his own voice carried a note of awe. "Sheathe your blade, son of Xanten. We would not have blood spilled in our hall over a demonstration of prowess." The hero slid Balmung back into its sheath, but the memory of its song lingered in the air like an echo of thunder. The court began to buzz with whispered conversations, speculation flying like sparks from an anvil. Who was this newcomer who bore such a weapon? What deeds had he performed to earn the right to wield it? "An impressive blade," the king's advisor said, his voice carefully neutral. "Pray tell, how came you by such a weapon?" The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. The young warrior could feel the weight of dozens of gazes upon him, could sense the currents of curiosity and suspicion that flowed through the assembled nobles. This was the moment of choice. How much to reveal? How much to conceal? "I won it in battle," he said simply, "from an enemy who no longer had need of it." It was truth, if not the whole truth. But the champion's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he sensed the gaps in the story. The man's reputation included an uncanny ability to read men's hearts, to see through deception as easily as others saw through clear water. Before the questioning could continue, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. Perhaps our guest would care to refresh himself before facing more questions. Every head in the hall turned toward the speaker, and the visitor felt his breath catch in his throat. Standing in the arched doorway that led to the royal quarters was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Kriemhild, sister to the Burgundian kings, moved into the hall with the grace of a swan gliding across still water. Her hair was gold as summer wheat, her eyes blue as the deepest ocean, her face so perfectly formed that poets would spend lifetimes trying to capture its beauty in mere words. But it was more than physical perfection that stopped conversations and turned heads. There was an inner light about her, a warmth that seemed to banish shadows and soften even the hardest hearts. She wore a gown of deep blue silk that complemented her eyes, its fabric so fine it seemed to float around her like mist. Jewels adorned her throat and wrists, but they paled beside the natural radiance of her smile. As she walked toward the throne, every man in the hall found himself straightening unconsciously, hoping to catch her attention if only for a moment. But her eyes were fixed on the hero. "Welcome to Worms, noble sir," she said, her voice carrying the music of silver bells on a summer breeze. "I am Kriemhild, daughter of this house. It would please me greatly if you would join us for the evening feast, that we might hear more of your travels and the lands beyond our borders." The invitation was more than mere courtesy. It was a royal command wrapped in velvet words, but the young man barely heard the formal phrases, lost as he was in the depths of those blue eyes. In that moment, standing in the great hall of Worms with the most beautiful woman in the world smiling at him, he felt something shift in his chest, something deeper than the transformation wrought by the worm's blood. This was love at first sight, as sudden and overwhelming as the strike of lightning, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. In the space of a heartbeat, the son of Xanten understood that his life had changed as fundamentally as when he first stepped into Fafnir's blood. The quest for glory that had driven him from his father's kingdom seemed suddenly hollow beside the possibility of winning this woman's heart. But even as love bloomed in his chest like a flower opening to the sun, he was aware of other eyes upon him, pale grey ones calculating and cold. Gunther's expression thoughtful, Gernot's frankly appraising. The politics of the court swirled around him like currents in a river, and he sensed that his arrival had disturbed some delicate balance. "The honour would be mine, my lady," he managed, hoping his voice did not betray the thundering of his heart. Kriemhild's smile widened, and in that expression he saw something that made his pulse quicken. Not just courtesy or royal politeness, but genuine interest. Perhaps even the first stirring of something deeper. As the court began to disperse in preparation for the evening's festivities, the king's champion moved to his sovereign's side. The scarred face wore an expression of deep thought, pale eyes following the guest as servants led him away to his quarters. "What think you of our visitor?" Gunther asked quietly. "I think," came the careful reply, "that he is more than he appears. That sword he bears, I have heard descriptions of such a blade in the oldest songs, and there is something about him, some quality that sets him apart from other men." "Dangerous?" The champion considered the question carefully. "Potentially, but perhaps useful as well. A warrior of his evident skill could be a valuable addition to our forces, especially if the rumors from the east prove true." Gunther nodded slowly. The rumors spoken of concerned the growing power of Queen Brunhild of Iceland, whose reputation for both beauty and strength had spread across the known world. Securing an alliance through marriage had become a political necessity, but it would require careful planning and considerable resources. "Watch him," the king commanded. "Learn what you can of his background, his motivations, his true purpose here, and arrange for a test, something that will show us the full extent of his abilities. And if he proves as formidable as I suspect, then we may have found the key to unlocking our greatest ambition." Gunther's eyes gleamed with the light of possibility. After all, even the strongest walls can be breached with the proper tools. As night fell over Worms, the great hall transformed itself for the evening feast. Torches blazed in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across the stone walls. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and fine wines, while minstrels tuned their instruments in preparation for the entertainment to come. The guest, now bathed and dressed in clothes befitting a royal visitor, took his assigned place at the high table. The position between Gernot and Gisela, with a clear view of both the king and his sister, spoke volumes about his reception. He was being honoured, but also watched. Throughout the meal, he found himself stealing glances at Kriemhild, marvelling at the way the torchlight played across her features, the graceful way she moved, the musical quality of her laughter. Each time their eyes met across the table, he felt that same electric shock of connection, that sense of destiny unfolding like a flower in the sun. But he was equally aware of the champion's presence, the way those pale eyes tracked his every movement, every expression. The scarred warrior said little during the meal, but his attention never wavered. It was like being watched by a hunting hawk, beautiful and deadly and utterly focused. As the wine flowed and the evening progressed, conversations grew more relaxed. Tales were told of distant battles and legendary heroes. Songs were sung of ancient glories and timeless loves. And gradually, inevitably, attention turned to the mysterious guest who had appeared in their midst bearing a sword of legend. "Tell us of your travels," Kriemhild requested, her voice cutting through the general conversation like a silver blade. What wonders have you seen in your journeys? What adventures have befallen you? The hall grew quiet, all attention focused on the young warrior. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the test that would determine his place in this court of kings. How much to reveal? How much to conceal? The wrong word could mean exile or death, but the right ones might open doors to glory beyond imagining. He chose his words carefully, speaking of distant forests and ancient ruins, of challenges overcome and mysteries unraveled. He told of battles with bandits and beasts, of treasures won and lost, of the strange and wonderful things that waited beyond the borders of civilization. It was all true in its way, though he carefully omitted any mention of dragons or transformation, of blood that granted near immortality, or swords that sang with their own power. As he spoke, he watched his audience's reactions. Gernot leaned forward with the interest of a fellow warrior, clearly impressed by tales of combat and courage. Gisela nodded thoughtfully at descriptions of foreign customs and distant lands. Gunther listened with the attention of a king, always seeking advantage, while Kriemhild's eyes never left his face, drinking in every word as if it were wine. But it was the champion's reaction that troubled him most. The advisor's expression remained unchanged throughout the recitation, but there was something in those pale eyes, a knowing look, as if he heard the gaps in the story and understood their significance. When the tales were finished and the applause had died away, the king's most trusted warrior rose from his seat. "Fine stories, young hero," the champion said, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "But words are wind, as my old teacher used to say. Would you care to give us a more practical demonstration of your prowess?" The challenge hung in the air, like smoke from a dying fire. Around the hall, conversation stopped as nobles and warriors alike turned to watch the confrontation unfold. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the test that would separate truth from boasting, the trial that would determine whether the newcomer was worthy of the place he sought. The son of Xanten rose slowly from his seat, meeting those pale eyes with steady resolve. "What manner of demonstration did you have in mind?" The scarred face split in what might charitably be called a smile. "Something simple. A contest of arms, perhaps. Nothing to the death. We are civilized men, after all, but sufficient to test the claims implicit in your tales." "My lord," Gunther warned, but the champion waved away his king's concern. "A friendly match, my sovereign. First blood, or perhaps first fall. What say you, hero? Are you willing to put your boasts to the test?" The hall held its collective breath. To refuse would be to admit cowardice, to accept eternal shame in a court where honor meant more than life itself. But to accept was to risk exposure, for how could any mortal warrior, no matter how skilled, stand against the legendary champion of Burgundy? The young man looked around the hall, seeing the expectant faces, the gleaming eyes of warriors hungry for spectacle. His gaze lingered for a moment on Kriemhild, seeing something in her expression, concern, perhaps, or even fear for his safety. Then he smiled. "I accept your challenge, Sir Champion. When would you prefer to settle this matter?" "Now seems as good a time as any," came the reply, a hand already moving to a sword hilt. "The courtyard is well lit, and we have more than enough witnesses." And so it was that the fate of kingdoms came to hang upon a simple contest of arms, a test that would reveal truths better left hidden and set in motion events that would shake the very foundations of the world. The wheel of fate spun faster, its momentum building toward catastrophe. The courtyard of worms had been transformed into an amphitheatre of anticipation. Torches blazed in iron brackets along the walls, casting dancing shadows across the cobblestones and turning the space into a theatre of fire and steel. The entire court had assembled to witness the contest, nobles in their finest garments, warriors still bearing the dust of distant campaigns, servants who had abandoned their duties to watch what promised to be an epic confrontation. In the center of the space, 2 circles had been marked in chalk upon the stones. Within this arena, honor would be tested and reputations forged or shattered. The rules were simple, as old as warfare itself. First blood or first fall would determine the victor. No strikes to kill, no weapons save sword and skill, no quarter asked or given until one man stood triumphant. The champion of Burgundy stood at the eastern edge of the circle, his scarred face impassive as he tested the weight of his blade. The weapon was a masterwork of the armorer's craft, its edge honed to razor sharpness, its balance perfect for both thrust and cut. This was the sword that had tasted the blood of 100 enemies, that had carved the champion's reputation from the bones of the fallen. Across from him, the son of Xanten made his own preparations. Balmung hummed softly in his hands, the legendary blade seeming to pulse with its own inner life. The weapon felt almost weightless, an extension of his transformed body, eager for the dance of combat that was to come. But even as he readied himself for battle, part of his mind remained focused on the deeper game being played. This was more than a simple test of skill. The challenge had been issued for reasons beyond mere curiosity about his prowess. The scarred warrior suspected something, perhaps not the full truth of the dragon's blood or the treasure's curse, but enough to warrant investigation. And the way the king watched from his place of honor, the calculating gleam in royal eyes, suggested that this contest would determine more than just martial skill. "Begin when ready," called Giano, who had been chosen to oversee the match. "May the best man stand victorious." The 2 warriors circled each other like hunting cats, each studying his opponent's stance, his grip, the subtle tells that might reveal weakness or intention. The champion moved with the fluid grace of long experience, his steps sure and measured, his blade held in perfect guard position. Here was a man who had survived 100 battles through skill and cunning, who read combat like a scholar read scrolls. But as they circled, something began to change in the younger warrior's bearing. The transformation that Fafnir's blood had wrought went deeper than mere invulnerability. It had enhanced his reflexes, sharpened his senses, granted him the predatory instincts of the great worm itself. He could smell his opponent's sweat, could hear the rapid beating of the man's heart, could sense the minute shifts in balance that preceded each movement. The first exchange came like lightning. The champion lunged forward with a thrust aimed at the heart, his blade moving with deadly precision. But the young warrior was no longer entirely where the thrust had been aimed. He had flowed aside like water, Balmung sweeping up to deflect the attack with a ring of steel on steel that echoed across the courtyard. The scarred fighter recovered instantly, his blade whipping around in a horizontal cut that would have taken his opponent's head. But again, the son of Xanten moved with inhuman grace, ducking beneath the strike and riposting with a cut of his own that whispered past the champion's ear. Around the circle, the watching crowd gasped at the speed and skill on display. These were not the clumsy exchanges of novice fighters, but the deadly dance of masters pushed to their limits. Steel rang against steel in patterns of attack and defense that blurred the eye, each warrior seeking the opening that would end the contest. But as the fight progressed, it became clear that something was amiss. The champion was skilled beyond measure, his technique flawless, his experience vast, yet he could not land a telling blow. Every thrust was turned aside, every cut deflected, every combination met with responses that seemed to anticipate his attacks before they were made. The younger warrior, for his part, held back the full extent of his transformed abilities. To reveal the true speed and strength that dragon's blood had granted him would raise questions he was not prepared to answer. Instead, he fought as a supremely skilled mortal might, pushing the boundaries of human capability without crossing into the realm of the supernatural. The crowd watched in growing amazement as the contest stretched on. Minutes passed, then a quarter hour, then more, yet neither warrior showed signs of fatigue. Sweat gleamed on both faces in the torchlight, but their breathing remained controlled, their movements sure and swift. It was then that the champion attempted his signature move, a faint high, followed by a lightning-fast thrust toward the kidney, a combination that had felled countless opponents. But as his blade drove forward, seeking the gap in his opponent's defense, something impossible happened. The younger warrior spun away from the thrust, Balmung describing a perfect arc that ended with its point resting against the champion's throat. The legendary blade had somehow passed through what should have been an impenetrable guard, finding the one angle of attack that mortal skill alone could never have discovered. Silence fell over the courtyard like a blanket of snow. The champion stood frozen, pale eyes wide with something that might have been recognition. The blade at his throat was steady as stone, its edge so sharp it had already drawn a thin line of blood from his skin. By the rules of the contest, the match was over. "Yield," the son of Xanten said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. For a long moment, the scarred warrior said nothing. Then, slowly, he stepped back and lowered his sword. "I yield," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Well fought, young hero. You have skills that go beyond mere training." The courtyard erupted in cheers and applause, but the son of Xanten barely heard them. His attention was fixed on the champion's face, on the calculating intelligence behind those pale eyes. The man suspected more than he was saying. Of that, there could be no doubt. As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about the remarkable display they had witnessed, the king approached the victor. The monarch's expression was thoughtful, his blue eyes holding a speculative gleam that spoke of wheels turning within wheels. "Impressive," the sovereign said simply. "Very impressive indeed. Perhaps we should speak privately, you and I. There are matters we might discuss to our mutual benefit." The private chambers of the Burgundian monarch were a study in controlled magnificence. Rich tapestries depicting the deeds of ancient heroes covered the stone walls, while a fire crackled merrily in a hearth carved with scenes of hunting and war. The furniture was simple but elegant, chairs that could seat a king in comfort, a table that had seen the planning of campaigns and the negotiation of treaties. The king poured wine from a silver pitcher, the vintage rich and red as blood in the crystal goblets. He offered one to his guest, then settled into his own chair with the ease of a man accustomed to command. "You fight well," the monarch began, his tone conversational. "Better than well, in truth. I have seen few warriors who could best my champion in single combat. He is skilled beyond measure," the younger man replied carefully. "I was fortunate in my timing." The sovereign smiled, an expression that held little warmth. "Fortunate? Yes, I'm sure that's all it was." He sipped his wine, studying his guest over the rim of the goblet. "Tell me, son of Xanten, what do you know of Queen Brunhild of Iceland?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, but the young warrior sensed the weight behind it. This was the true purpose of their meeting, the reason he had been brought to these private chambers. "I know the stories that travelers tell," he said slowly. "A queen of great beauty and greater strength, who rules a realm where winter holds eternal sway. They say she has never been defeated in combat, that she possesses the strength of 10 men, that she will marry only the warrior who can best her in trials of skill and courage." "The stories are true," the king said, leaning forward in his chair. "I have seen her with my own eyes, spoken with ambassadors who have witnessed her prowess. She is everything the tales claim and more. Beautiful beyond description, powerful beyond measure, and utterly unconquerable." "And you wish to marry her," the guest observed. "I wish to secure an alliance that would make Burgundy the greatest power in the known world," the monarch corrected. "Her hand in marriage would bring with it control of the northern trade routes, alliance with the island kingdoms, and access to wealth beyond imagining. But more than that, it would prove to all the world that the Burgundian crown stands supreme among the kingdoms of men." The younger warrior nodded thoughtfully. "But the trials are said to be impossible for mortal men to survive," the sovereign finished. "Contests of strength that have left previous suitors dead or broken, challenges that test not only skill, but the very limits of human endurance. I am a capable warrior, but I am not fool enough to believe I could succeed where heroes of legend have failed." The implication hung in the air between them, like smoke from the dying fire. The king was proposing something that walked the razor's edge between alliance and treachery, between strategy and outright deception. "What exactly are you suggesting?" the son of Xanten asked. The royal smile widened, and for a moment handsome features took on an almost predatory cast. "You possess skills that go beyond the merely human. That much was clear from your contest with my champion. Perhaps skills that might prove sufficient to overcome the Queen's trials. And I possess the resources and authority to organize an expedition to Iceland, to present myself as a suitor worthy of royal consideration. You want me to compete in your place. I want you to help me win what I could never win alone," the king said carefully. "The specifics of how that help is rendered, well, those are details we can work out to our mutual satisfaction." The young warrior was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of what was being proposed. To help the monarch deceive Queen Brunhild would be to participate in a fraud that could have consequences beyond imagining. Yet the alternative, refusing the royal request, might mean exile from the court he had come to consider home, separation from the woman who had captured his heart. "And in exchange," he asked finally, "in exchange, you would have my eternal gratitude, a place of honor among my knights, and—" The sovereign paused, his eyes glittering with calculation. "And the hand of my sister in marriage." The words hit like a physical blow. The princess's hand in marriage. The very thing he had dreamed of since first setting eyes on her. The prize that would make all his struggles worthwhile. But the price? "I will need time to consider your proposal," he said. "Of course," came the smooth reply. "But do not take too long. The sailing season grows short, and if we are to reach Iceland before the winter storms make travel impossible, we must depart within the fortnight." As the young warrior made his way back to his chambers, his mind churned with the weight of the decision before him. To help the king would mean participating in a deception that violated every code of honor he had been raised to follow. But to refuse might mean losing not only his place in the Burgundian court, but his chance at happiness with the most wonderful woman he had ever known. It was then that he encountered her. The royal sister stood in the moonlit garden, her golden hair gleaming like captured starlight, her blue gown flowing around her like mist. She turned as he approached, and the smile that lit her face was like sunrise after the longest night. "I watched the contest," she said softly. "You were magnificent." "Your brother's champion is a formidable opponent," he replied, moving closer. "I was fortunate to prevail." "Fortune had little to do with it," she said, stepping closer still. "I have watched many warriors compete in my brother's service, but I have never seen anything like what you displayed tonight. There is something about you, something that sets you apart from other men." They stood close enough now that he could smell the subtle perfume she wore, could see the way the moonlight caught the gold flecks in her blue eyes. Every instinct screamed at him to take her in his arms, to declare his love and damn the consequences. But honor held him back, the weight of secrets and responsibilities that he could not share. "My lady," he began, but she silenced him with a gesture. "When we are alone, I would have you use my name," she corrected gently. He repeated her name, and the word felt like a prayer on his lips. "There is something I must tell you. Your brother has made me an offer." "I know," she interrupted softly. "He told me of his plan to seek Queen Brunhild's hand, and I know what he has asked of you." The admission hung between them like a sword blade. If she knew of the royal proposal, then she understood the implications as well as he did. The deception, the betrayal of trust, the violation of honor that would be required. "And what do you counsel?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the distant stars. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I counsel you to follow your heart," she said. "Whatever choice you make, let it be one you can live with when all the songs are sung and all the tales are told." Before he could respond, she had turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the moonlit garden with the weight of destiny pressing down upon his shoulders. The next morning brought word that would make the decision for him. A messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, his clothes bearing the dust of hard riding. The news he carried spread through the court like wildfire. Raiders from the north had struck at Burgundian settlements along the Rhine, burning villages and carrying off captives. Worse still, the raiders bore the devices of Queen Brunhild's war bands. "It seems," the monarch announced grimly as his war council assembled, "that our northern neighbor seeks to test our resolve. These attacks cannot go unanswered, but neither can we afford open war with Iceland while our forces are scattered and our allies uncertain." The implication was clear to all who heard it. A diplomatic solution was needed, and quickly. The offer of marriage alliance suddenly took on new urgency, transforming from political advantage to military necessity. "The expedition to Iceland will depart within the week," the king declared. "We sail with a full complement of warriors and the finest gifts our treasury can provide. Queen Brunhild will see that Burgundy offers alliance from a position of strength, not weakness." As the council dispersed to make preparations, the son of Xanten found himself face to face with a choice that would determine not only his own fate, but the destiny of kingdoms. To refuse the royal proposal now would mean abandoning the realm to potential invasion, leaving the woman he loved vulnerable to the depredations of war. To accept would mean becoming complicit in a deception that might have consequences beyond imagining. But as he stood in the great hall of worms, watching servants hurry about their preparations, watching the princess speak quietly with her brothers about the coming voyage. He realized that the choice had already been made. His love for her, his growing loyalty to the Burgundian court, his own burning need to prove himself worthy of legend, all pointed toward the same conclusion. He would help the king win Queen Brunhild's hand in marriage. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, he would play his part in the deception to come. The die was cast. The wheel of fate spun faster, carrying them all toward a destiny that none could foresee, but all would rue. Within days, the expedition was ready. 3 ships lay at anchor in the Rhine's grey waters, their hulls black as ravens, their sails white as winter snow. Provision chests lined their decks alongside weapon racks and the tents that would shelter the expedition during their stay in Iceland. The finest warriors of Burgundy had volunteered for the voyage, eager to witness the contest that would determine their kingdom's future. But it was the 4th passenger who gave the enterprise its true purpose. Hidden beneath travel cloaks and common garments, bearing weapons wrapped in cloth to disguise their true nature, the son of Xanten prepared for the greatest deception of his life. As the ships slipped their moorings and began their journey north, he stood at the stern, watching worms disappear into the river mist. Somewhere in that fading city, the woman he loved waited for their return. Whether he came back as hero or villain, as bridegroom or exile, remained to be seen. The voyage to Iceland would test more than the king's worthiness as a suitor. It would test the very limits of honor, loyalty, and love. And in the testing, it would set in motion the events that would ultimately destroy them all. The wheel of fate turned faster still, its momentum building toward the catastrophe that awaited them in the frozen north. The northern seas were a realm of grey desolation, where steel-coloured waters stretched to horizons that seemed to mark the very edge of the world. For 7 days, the 3 ships fought their way through swells that could swallow mountains, their black hulls rising and falling with the rhythm of some primordial heartbeat. The wind sang through the rigging with voices that spoke of storms to come, while overhead the sky remained the colour of old iron, promising neither sun nor mercy. Iceland appeared through the morning mist like a vision from a fever dream. Towering cliffs of black volcanic stone rose from waters so dark they seemed to drink the light. Glaciers crowned the distant mountains like the helms of sleeping giants, their ice blue as winter stars. Waterfalls plunged from impossible heights, their spray creating rainbows that seemed almost blasphemous in such a harsh landscape. But it was the fortress that dominated the view, a structure carved from the living rock itself, its towers spiraling upward like frozen flames. This was no mortal stronghold, but something from the world's youth, when gods walked among men and queens commanded powers that made kings tremble. Banners snapped from its highest towers, bearing devices that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. The harbour was carved from the base of the cliff, a perfect crescent of deep water protected from the worst of the ocean's fury. Ships lay at anchor there, vessels from a dozen kingdoms, their hulls bearing the scars of long voyages and desperate battles. These were the ships of other suitors, other heroes who had come to test themselves against the unconquerable queen. Not all of them would be sailing home. As the Burgundian vessels entered the harbour, figures appeared on the quayside to greet them. These were no ordinary courtiers, but warriors whose very presence spoke of powers beyond mortal ken. They moved with the fluid grace of predators, their eyes holding depths that reflected neither warmth nor mercy. When they spoke, their voices carried harmonics that resonated in the bones. "Welcome, men of Burgundy. Their leader called as the ships drew alongside the dock. "I am Atli, Marshal of Queen Brunhild's household. Her Majesty has been expecting you." The royal party disembarked with all the ceremony befitting their station. The sovereign wore his finest mail beneath a cloak of royal purple, his crown glinting gold in the pale northern light. His brothers flanked him in their own finery, while behind them came the pick of Burgundian nobility. But it was the fourth member of their party who drew the closest scrutiny. A warrior whose face was hidden beneath a helm, whose true identity was known only to the inner circle. The climb to the fortress was treacherous, winding up the cliff face along paths that seemed carved by giants. With each step, the wind grew colder, more bitter, carrying whispers in languages that predated human speech. Below them, the ships grew smaller until they resembled children's toys bobbing in a vast grey basin. The great hall of Queen Brunhild was a wonder that defied description. The walls were carved from living ice that never melted, their surfaces reflecting light in patterns that dazzled the eye and confused the mind. Pillars of frozen flame supported a ceiling lost in shadow, while the floor was polished stone that showed reflections of things that were not there. And upon a throne carved from a single massive diamond sat the most beautiful and terrible woman any of them had ever beheld. Queen Brunhild was tall as a warrior, her frame showing the lean strength of one who had never known defeat. Her hair was the colour of spun platinum, falling to her shoulders like a waterfall of liquid silver. Her skin was pale as northern snow, unmarked by sun or scar, perfect as carved marble. But it was her eyes that held them, deep blue as glacial ice, filled with an intelligence ancient and pitiless. She wore armour that seemed wrought from winter itself, its plates shifting and flowing like frozen water. At her side lay a spear that hummed with its own dark power, while across her knees rested a sword that made strong men's hearts falter. This was no mortal queen, but something from the world's dawn, a being of such power that even the gods treated her with wary respect. "So," she said, and her voice was like wind over Arctic wastes, "another king comes seeking my hand. Tell me, royal one of Burgundy, what makes you think you can succeed where so many heroes have perished?" The monarch stepped forward, his courage evident despite the supernatural aura that pressed against him like a physical weight. "Your Majesty, I come not as a conqueror, but as one seeking alliance between our realms. Burgundy offers strength, wealth, and honour to match your own." The queen's laugh was like ice breaking on a winter lake. "Pretty words, but I have heard them before. The bones of the last man who spoke such platitudes lie beneath my throne. If you would have my hand, you must prove yourself worthy, through trials that will test your strength, your skill, and your very soul." She rose from her throne in one fluid motion, her armour singing with a sound like distant thunder. "3 contests there shall be. First, a test of strength. You must match me throw for throw with the great spear. Second, a trial of speed. You must outpace me in the sacred stone casting. Third, a contest of will. You must best me in single combat until blood is drawn or submission given." The conditions hung in the frigid air like a death sentence. Around the hall, the watching courtiers smiled with predatory anticipation. They had seen this drama played out before, had watched as heroes and kings met their doom against their mistress's supernatural prowess. "And if I should fail?" the sovereign asked, though his voice remained steady. "Then you and all your companions will join the others who thought themselves my equal," she replied, gesturing toward the shadows at the hall's edges, where shapes that might once have been men stood in eternal silence. But if you should triumph, an outcome I find unlikely, then I will wed you and bring my power to your service." The young warrior, hidden beneath cloak and helm, felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment they had prepared for, the test that would determine whether their deception could succeed. But seeing the queen's inhuman beauty, sensing the power that radiated from her like heat from a forge, he wondered if even his dragon-enhanced abilities would prove sufficient. "I accept your terms," the king declared, though those who knew him best could hear the slight tremor in his voice. "Excellent," the queen purred. "The trials will begin at sunset. Use the remaining daylight to prepare yourselves, and perhaps to make peace with whatever gods you serve." As the Burgundian party was led to their quarters, the disguised hero found himself walking beside the champion, whose pale eyes held a knowing gleam. "An impressive display," the scarred warrior murmured quietly. "But I trust you remember our agreement. The trials must be won, whatever the cost." "I remember," came the whispered reply. "But this will require all the skill at my disposal. The queen is more than mortal. I can sense it in her very presence." "Then it is fortunate," the champion said with grim satisfaction, "that you are more than mortal as well." The hours until sunset passed like a fever dream. The Burgundian party made their preparations in chambers carved from the living ice, while outside the wind howled with voices that spoke of ancient hungers and forgotten griefs. Servants moved through the halls like ghosts, their eyes reflecting depths that suggested they had looked upon things best left unseen. As the pale northern sun began its descent toward the horizon, the contestants were summoned to the courtyard. The space was vast, surrounded by tiers of carved stone, where the queen's retainers gathered to witness the spectacle. Torches burned with flames that cast no warmth, their light illuminating an arena that had seen the death of heroes. Queen Brunhild stood in the center of the space, her armor gleaming like captured starlight. In her hands she held the great spear, its point wreathed in mist that moved with a life of its own. When she planted its butt against the stone, the very foundations of the fortress trembled. "First trial," she announced, her voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "The contest of strength. You must match my cast, throw for throw, until one of us fails." The king stepped forward, his face pale but determined. He took the spear from her hands and immediately staggered under its weight. The weapon was massive beyond belief, its shaft thick as a man's thigh, its point gleaming with edges that seemed to cut the very air. No mortal man could hope to lift such a thing, let alone cast it with accuracy. But as the monarch raised the spear, preparing to make his attempt, a shadow fell across him. The disguised warrior had moved closer, his cloak of invisibility allowing him to stand virtually atop the king without being seen. Together, their combined strength, one mortal, one enhanced by dragon's blood, lifted the impossible weapon. The spear flew through the air like a bolt of lightning, its passage creating thunder that echoed off the fortress walls. It struck the target with such force that the wooden disc exploded into splinters, the spear burying itself so deep in the stone wall beyond that only its fletching remained visible. A murmur of surprise ran through the watching crowd. Never before had a mortal contestant achieved such a cast on the first trial. Queen Brunhild's eyes narrowed slightly, but she showed no other sign of concern. With casual ease, she retrieved the spear and took her own stance. Her throw was a thing of terrible beauty, the weapon seeming to bend space itself as it flew. It struck the exact center of a fresh target with such precision that the wood split along its grain, the pieces falling away like flower petals. Acceptable, she conceded. Second trial, the stone casting. The stones were massive granite blocks, each one requiring the strength of 10 men to lift. The contest was simple. Whoever could cast their stone the furthest would claim victory in this trial. But as the queen hefted her stone with the ease of a child lifting a pebble, the Burgundian party felt their hearts sink. Again, the invisible presence aided the struggling king. Dragonborn strength combined with mortal determination, and the stone flew through the air to land with a crash that shook the very mountains. But when the queen made her cast, her stone flew even further, disappearing into the darkness beyond the torchlight. Close, she admitted, though her tone suggested anything but approval. But not quite sufficient. Perhaps the final trial will prove more decisive. The combat trial was to be fought with swords, first blood determining the victor. As the queen drew her blade, the air itself seemed to recoil from its edge. This was no earthly weapon, but something forged in the world's youth by powers that had been old when the first men learned to speak. The king drew his own sword, a fine weapon, but pitifully inadequate against what faced him. As the combat began, it quickly became clear that no amount of skill could overcome the supernatural gap between them. The queen moved like liquid lightning, her blade striking with the force of falling mountains. It was then that the true deception began. The invisible warrior stepped fully into the combat, his enhanced speed and strength allowing him to guide the king's movements, to parry blows that would have been fatal, to strike back with precision no mortal could achieve. To the watching crowd, it appeared as though their king had suddenly become a warrior of legendary skill. The battle raged across the courtyard, blade ringing against blade in patterns too complex for mortal eyes to follow. The queen's expression changed from confidence to surprise to something approaching concern, as her opponent proved far more capable than expected. But it was the final exchange that sealed their victory and their doom. The disguised warrior, growing careless in his confidence, allowed his cloak to slip for just an instant. Queen Brunhild's superhuman senses caught the glimpse of a second figure, the brief revelation of the deception being played upon her. Her eyes blazed with fury, but she was committed to the combat, her blade already descending in what should have been a killing blow. The king's sword, guided by invisible hands, turned the strike aside and riposted with a cut that drew a thin line of blood across the queen's perfect cheek. Silence fell over the courtyard like a burial shroud. Queen Brunhild touched the wound with one finger, staring at the crimson drop that stained her skin. For 1,000 years, no weapon had marked her flesh. For 1,000 years, she had been invincible, unconquerable, supreme. Now she had been defeated by what appeared to be a mortal king. "The trials are concluded," she said, finally, her voice carefully controlled. "You have proven yourself worthy, King of Burgundy. I will honor my word and become your bride." But as she spoke the words of acceptance, her eyes continued to search the courtyard. She had sensed something during the combat, some wrongness that she could not quite identify. The seeds of suspicion had been planted, and in time they would grow into a tree that would bear bitter fruit indeed. The wedding preparations began immediately, for Queen Brunhild was not one to delay when her word had been given. The ceremony would take place before the full moon reached its zenith, sealing the alliance between Iceland and Burgundy with bonds that supposedly could never be broken. But as the Burgundian party celebrated their impossible victory, none of them noticed the way their hostess watched them with eyes like winter stars, calculating and cold. The deception had succeeded. But its very success had sown the seeds of a vengeance that would make the frozen north seem warm by comparison. The wheel of fate spun faster, carrying them all toward a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of the world. The wedding feast was a spectacle that defied mortal comprehension. The great hall had been transformed into something from legend. Its ice walls hung with tapestries that told stories of heroes and gods, its floor covered with furs from beasts that had never known the touch of sunlight. Long tables groaned under the weight of delicacies from across the known world, while mead flowed from horns carved from the tusks of creatures that dwelt in the ocean's deepest places. Queen Brunhild sat beside her new husband, her beauty undimmed by the ceremony that had bound them together. She wore a gown of silver silk that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury, while her crown was wrought from ice that never melted and gems that captured the light of distant stars. To all appearances, she was the perfect bride, gracious in victory and generous in defeat. But those who looked closely might have noticed that her smiles never reached her eyes, that her laughter held no warmth, that her gaze continued to search the assembled guests as if seeking something that remained hidden. The wedding night, however, would reveal the true cost of their deception. The wedding night brought humiliation beyond bearing. In the royal chambers carved from living ice, King of Burgundy discovered that winning Queen Brunhild's hand had been only the beginning of his trials. The supernatural queen's strength did not diminish with marriage. If anything, her fury at what she increasingly suspected had been a deception made her more formidable than ever. When the sovereign attempted to claim his marital rights, the Ice Queen's response was swift and devastating. With casual ease, she bound him with silk cords that held like iron chains, hanging him from a beam where he spent the night in helpless rage while she slept peacefully below. The message was clear. Their marriage might be legal, but she would not submit to any man she suspected of trickery. It was only through another intervention, the invisible warrior once again coming to his king's aid in the darkness, that the binding was broken and the queen finally subdued. But the cost of this second deception was the taking of her belt and ring, tokens of her defeat that would later prove more dangerous than any sword. The return journey to Burgundy was accomplished in sullen silence. The new queen sat in her ship's prow like a carved figurehead, her beauty unmarred, but her eyes holding depths of winter that promised storms to come. She spoke little during the voyage, and when she did, her words carried undertones of suspicion that made even the bravest warriors nervous. But it was when they reached Worms that the true celebration began. The city had been transformed for the homecoming. Banners flew from every tower, their colours bright against the summer sky. The streets were carpeted with flowers, while citizens lined the roads to cheer their returning heroes. Word had spread of the impossible victory, of the alliance that would make Burgundy the greatest power in the known world. In the great hall, a double wedding awaited. The princess stood at the altar beside her beloved, her face radiant with joy that seemed to banish all shadows from the ancient stones. She wore a gown of pure white silk, embroidered with threads of gold, her hair crowned with flowers that perfumed the air with their sweetness. This was love triumphant, passion rewarded, the fairy tale ending that every ballad promised. Beside them, the royal pair presented a stark contrast. Queen Brunhild's beauty remained undiminished, but it was the cold perfection of carved marble. Her wedding gown was silver as winter frost, adorned with gems that glittered like captured ice. When she spoke her vows, her voice carried no warmth, no joy, only the formal acknowledgement of binding words that could not be unsaid. The celebration that followed was magnificent beyond description. The finest wines flowed like rivers, while minstrels sang of heroic deeds and legendary loves. Acrobats and jugglers performed feats that dazzled the eye, while the greatest knights of the kingdom competed in contests of skill and strength. But at the high table, tension hung in the air, like smoke from a dying fire. The son of Xanten, now revealed in his true identity and wed to the woman of his dreams, found himself the object of Queen Brunhild's relentless scrutiny. Her pale blue eyes tracked his every movement, studied his every expression, searched for some sign of the deception she increasingly believed had been played upon her. "Tell me, noble hero," she said during a lull in the festivities, her voice carrying clearly across the high table. "How came you by that remarkable sword you bear? It seems familiar to me, though I cannot place where I might have seen its like." The question was casual enough, but those who knew the Ice Queen recognized the steel beneath the silk. This was not idle curiosity, but an interrogation disguised as conversation. "A family heirloom," he replied carefully, "passed down through generations of my line. My grandfather won it in battle, though the details of that victory have been lost to time." "How interesting," she murmured, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. "And during your recent travels, before you came to serve my husband's court, did you perhaps encounter any unusual opponents? Dragons, perhaps, or other creatures of legend?" The hall had grown quieter, nobles and warriors alike sensing the undercurrents flowing between the two. Even the minstrels had reduced their playing to a whisper, the better to follow this dangerous game of words. "A man might encounter many strange things in the wild places of the world," he said, "but surely your majesty knows that travellers' tales grow in the telling. What might seem like a dragon in the heat of battle could prove to be nothing more than a particularly large bear or wolf." Queen Brunhild's smile was winter sharp. "Indeed, though I have found that the most dangerous deceptions are often those wrapped in truth. Wouldn't you agree, sister?" The last word was addressed to the princess, who had been following the exchange with growing unease. The term of address was technically correct. They were now sisters through marriage, but something in the Ice Queen's tone made it sound like a challenge. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," the princess replied cautiously. "Oh, but I think you do," Brunhild continued, her voice taking on a silken quality that made strong men reach instinctively for their swords. "After all, you were present when the plans were made, were you not? When strategies were discussed and roles assigned." The accusation hung in the air, like a sword blade suspended by a thread. Around the high table, faces had gone pale, as nobles began to understand that they were witnessing more than a casual conversation. "I think there has been some misunderstanding," the king began, but his queen silenced him with a gesture. "Has there?" she asked, her gaze never leaving the princess's face. "Or has there perhaps been a very careful understanding, planned and executed with the precision of a military campaign?" It was then that the princess made her fatal mistake. Rising from her chair with the dignity befitting her station, she drew herself to her full height and spoke with the authority of royal blood. "I will not sit here and listen to veiled accusations from a guest in my father's hall," she declared. "If you have something to say, speak plainly. Otherwise, I suggest you remember your place." The words fell into silence like stones into still water, their ripples spreading outward to encompass the entire hall. Every person present understood that a line had been crossed, that the careful balance of courtesy and diplomacy had shattered like glass. Queen Brunhild rose slowly from her chair, her movement fluid and predatory. When she spoke, her voice carried the chill of Arctic winds. "My place," she repeated, each word precise as a blade thrust. "I am a queen by right of birth and conquest, daughter of powers that ruled when your ancestors were yet savages painting themselves blue. I have never known defeat in battle, never bent the knee to any mortal lord, never been bested by any warrior who walked upon two legs." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle upon the assembled nobles. "Until your husband's miraculous victory in Iceland," she continued. "Tell me, sister, how does it feel to be wed to a man who required such assistance to win his bride?" The accusation was out now, naked and undeniable. Every person in the hall understood what was being suggested, that the trials had been won through deception, that the marriage was founded upon fraud. The princess's face flushed crimson with anger and embarrassment. In that moment, her love for her husband and her pride in her royal blood overwhelmed her judgment. Reaching into her bodice, she drew forth two objects that glittered in the torchlight: a belt of woven silver and a ring set with gems that held their own inner fire. "You speak of defeat," she said, her voice ringing with triumph and fury. "Then perhaps you recognize these, tokens taken from a queen who discovered that even her supernatural strength has limits. The belt and ring, Queen Brunhild's own regalia, taken during that second night of deception, hung between them like an accusation and a proof." The Ice Queen's face went white as winter snow, her eyes widening with shock and understanding. "How?" she whispered, then stopped, the pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the great hall understood that they had witnessed something that would change everything, that the careful edifice of alliance and friendship had crumbled in the space of a heartbeat. When Queen Brunhild spoke again, her voice carried the promise of death. "So," she said, each word falling like a drop of poison, "the truth at last. My husband is a fraud, my marriage a mockery, my defeat achieved through the basest trickery." Her gaze fixed upon the son of Xanten with laser intensity. "And you, noble hero, are the weapon they used to steal what could never be won honestly." The accusation hung in the air like the tolling of a funeral bell. Around the hall, warriors' hands moved instinctively to sword hilts, while nobles began to edge toward the exits. Everyone present could feel the storm gathering, could sense that they stood on the precipice of catastrophe. But it was the king's champion who moved first. The scarred warrior rose from his place with deadly calm, his pale eyes fixed upon the son of Xanten with an expression that promised violence. Here was a man who had served the royal house faithfully for decades, who had built his entire identity around loyalty to the crown. To see that service mocked, that loyalty betrayed by foreign deception, was more than his warrior's heart could bear. "The insult to my king cannot be borne," he declared, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent hall. "The alliance built upon lies cannot stand. The deception that has shamed my sovereign demands blood in payment." The princess turned to her husband with eyes wide with terror, understanding at last the full magnitude of what her moment of pride had cost them. "I didn't mean, I never intended." But the words were hollow, meaningless against the weight of revelation. The truth was out now, spreading through the hall like wildfire, impossible to contain or deny. Queen Brunhild stood motionless in the center of the chaos, her beautiful face a mask of ice that revealed nothing of the fury burning within. When she finally spoke, her words carried the finality of a death sentence. "This insult will be answered," she said simply. This deception will be paid for. This betrayal will be avenged. She turned to the king's champion, her voice taking on a tone of command that brooked no argument. "You serve your sovereign faithfully," she said. "Prove that service now. Remove the source of his shame, the weapon that was used against his wife, the man whose very existence mocks the honor of your house." The challenge was explicit, undeniable. The champion's scarred face showed no emotion as he nodded slowly, accepting the task that had been laid upon him. "It will be done," he said simply. And with those 3 words, the fate of heroes was sealed, the doom of kingdoms assured, and the wheel of tragedy set spinning toward its inevitable conclusion. The great hall erupted into chaos as nobles and warriors took sides, as alliances shattered and new enmities were born. But through it all, the son of Xanten sat frozen in his chair, understanding at last the true price of the deception he had helped perpetrate. He had won his heart's desire, had claimed the hand of the woman he loved above life itself. But in doing so, he had sown the seeds of his own destruction, had set in motion events that would ultimately consume them all. The years that followed were marked by an uneasy peace, a cold war fought with glances and whispers rather than swords and spears. Queen Brunhild remained in Burgundy, playing the role of dutiful wife while her hatred festered like an untreated wound. She spoke little, smiled less, and watched everything with eyes that missed nothing. The princess, now fully aware of the consequences of her outburst, tried desperately to make amends. She sought audiences with her sister-in-law, offered gifts and gestures of friendship, attempted to bridge the gap that her moment of pride had torn open. But the Ice Queen received these overtures with cool politeness that was somehow worse than open hostility. The son of Xanten, meanwhile, found his position increasingly precarious. Though still officially honored as a hero of the realm, he could feel the weight of suspicious gazes, could sense the whispered conversations that ceased when he entered a room. The champion watched him constantly, looking for an opportunity to fulfill the promise he had made. Yet despite the undercurrents of tension, life in the court continued. There were feasts and festivals, tournaments and hunts, the endless round of ceremonies that marked the passage of royal seasons. The king and his brothers worked to strengthen their realm, negotiating treaties and building alliances that would secure Burgundy's future. A son was born to the royal couple, a beautiful child with his mother's golden hair and his father's strong limbs. The princess doted upon the boy, finding in him a source of joy that helped ease the weight of guilt she carried. When she looked upon her child, she could almost believe that the happiness she had found was worth the price that had been paid for it. But Queen Brunhild watched the child as well, her pale eyes holding depths that promised the sins of the parents would be visited upon the innocent. The peaceful years stretched on, marked by the changing of seasons and the slow passage of time. To outward appearances, the court of Burgundy prospered under its dual rule. Trade flourished, the borders remained secure, and the people lived in contentment under the protection of their warrior kings. Yet beneath the surface, the poison continued to spread. The Ice Queen's patience was legendary, as vast and inexorable as the glaciers of her homeland. She could wait decades for her revenge, could nurture her hatred through countless seasons until it grew into something magnificent and terrible. And when the moment finally came, when the perfect opportunity presented itself, she would strike with all the accumulated fury of the wronged. The spark that would ignite the conflagration came, as such things often do, from the most innocent of sources. It was a festival day in late spring, when the court had gathered to celebrate the blessing of the fields. The ceremony required the participation of both queens, their presence necessary to ensure the favor of whatever gods watched over the harvest. As tradition demanded, they would process together to the cathedral, their procession marking the official beginning of the celebration. But as they prepared to enter the sacred space, a question arose that had never been settled. Which queen should enter first? The question of precedence hung in the spring air like the blade of an executioner's axe. Before the cathedral doors, beneath the eyes of the assembled court and the watching citizens of Worms, two queens faced each other in a confrontation that would reshape the destiny of kingdoms. The princess stood radiant in cloth of gold, her beauty unmarked by the years, her bearing regal despite the tension that crackling between them. Across from her, Queen Brunhild waited in silver and ice-blue silk, her pale eyes holding depths of winter that promised storms to come. "Surely, sister, you do not expect to precede me into God's house," the Ice Queen said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush. "I am a queen by right of birth and conquest, while you are merely the wife of a knight, however elevated his recent station might be." The words were calculated insults, designed to cut deep and leave scars that would never heal. Around them, the watching nobles held their breath, understanding that they witnessed more than a simple dispute over protocol. The princess's face flushed with anger and wounded pride. "Wife of a knight," she repeated, her voice rising. "I am sister to 3 kings, daughter of a royal house that ruled when your frozen realm was yet unnamed. My husband is the greatest hero of our age, a man whose deeds will be sung when your ice castles have melted into the sea." Greatest hero. Queen Brunhild's laugh was like winter wind through barren trees. "Tell me, sister, what heroic deed first brought your husband to prominence? What great enemy did he face in single combat? What treasure did he win through his own strength and courage?" The questions struck like arrows, finding their mark. Every person present knew the stories. How the son of Xanten had arrived at court bearing a legendary sword. How he had bested the king's champion in combat. How he had helped win Queen Brunhild's hand through trials of supernatural difficulty. But now, with the Ice Queen's suspicions hanging over everything like a shroud, those tales took on a different cast. "You know very well what he has accomplished," the princess said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Indeed I do," Brunhild replied, her smile sharp as a blade. "I know exactly how he won his reputation, exactly what heroic deeds elevated him to his current station. Shall I share that knowledge with our audience?" The threat was explicit. Here, in front of the entire court, the Ice Queen was offering to reveal the full extent of the deception that had won her hand. The invisible assistance, the supernatural aid, the violation of honor that had made the impossible victory possible. It was then that the princess made her second fatal mistake. Driven by pride and desperation, she reached once again for the tokens she had foolishly displayed years before. The belt and ring emerged from beneath her cloak, their silver and gems catching the morning light like captured stars. "You speak of knowledge," she cried, holding the regalia high for all to see. "Then know this. These tokens were taken from you in combat, claimed by a hero who proved stronger than the Ice Queen's vaunted might. You may question his other deeds, but you cannot deny the evidence of your own defeat." The revelation struck the assembled crowd like a thunderbolt. Gasps of shock and amazement rippled through the nobles, while the common folk pressed closer to get a better view of the impossible proof. Queen Brunhild's own regalia, taken in combat from the unconquerable Ice Queen. It was evidence of a victory that bordered on the divine. But those who watched Queen Brunhild's face saw something that chilled them to the bone. The Ice Queen's expression did not show the embarrassment or anger they expected. Instead, her pale features took on a look of terrible understanding, of pieces falling into place to complete a picture of devastating clarity. "Combat," she repeated softly, though her words carried clearly in the sudden silence. Yes, there was indeed combat on my wedding night. But not, I think, in the manner our audience imagines. She stepped closer to the princess, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow reached every ear. "Tell them, sister, how exactly were these tokens taken? Describe for our eager audience the precise nature of this heroic victory. Was it perhaps won by a warrior who fought while invisible, who struck from shadows while my husband stood helpless as a bound captive?" The accusation hung in the air, like the stench of carrion. Around them, the court began to understand the full implications of what was being suggested. Not just deception in the trials, but violation of the marriage bed itself, assistance given in the most intimate of circumstances. The princess went white as winter snow, understanding too late that her pride had led her into a trap from which there could be no escape. I never said." "You said enough." Queen Brunhild cut her off, her voice now carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "More than enough to confirm what I have long suspected. Your husband is not the hero he pretends to be. Your marriage was built upon a foundation of lies, and your pride in his victories is as false as the deeds themselves." She turned to address the stunned crowd, her voice rising to carry across the cathedral square. "Behold the truth, people of Burgundy. Your celebrated hero, your legendary warrior, your supposed champion, all of it built upon deception and trickery. The trials in Iceland were won through invisible assistance. The contest decided by supernatural aid, hidden from honest eyes. What you have celebrated as heroism was nothing more than elaborate fraud." The crowd erupted into chaos. Some nobles shouted denials, others demanded proof, while still others began to reassess everything they thought they knew about the son of Xanten. In the growing tumult, weapons began to appear as ancient feuds and new suspicions boiled over into violence. But it was the king's champion who acted with deadly purpose. The scarred warrior had heard enough. Years of growing suspicion, months of careful observation, and now this public revelation had crystallized his resolve into something harder than steel. Moving through the chaos with predatory grace, he reached the princess's side in 3 swift strides. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a sword through silk. "This shame will not stand. This insult to my sovereign's honor demands blood in payment." The princess turned to him with desperate eyes, understanding at last the magnitude of what her words had unleashed. "Please, you must understand. I spoke in anger. I never meant." "You meant to wound your rival with proof of your husband's prowess," the champion said coldly. "In doing so, you have revealed the extent of the deception that has made fools of us all. That revelation cannot be undone, but its source can be eliminated." The threat was unmistakable. Around them, the chaos continued to build as the court fractured along lines of loyalty and suspicion. But the champion's attention was fixed solely on the woman who had just destroyed everything he had spent his life protecting. "Where is your husband?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. He's hunting with the king," she stammered. "They departed at dawn for the royal forest." The champion smiled, an expression that held no warmth whatsoever. "How convenient. Perhaps it is time I joined that hunt." As he turned to go, Queen Brunhild caught his arm. When she spoke, her words carried the chill of Arctic winds. "Remember," she said quietly, "justice delayed is justice denied. The insult to my honor, the mockery of my defeat, the violation of my person, all of these demand answer. See that it is given." The champion nodded grimly. "It will be done, my queen. Before the sun sets, the source of your shame will trouble you no more." He departed immediately, gathering a small group of trusted men and riding hard for the royal hunting grounds. Behind him, the court of Burgundy dissolved into accusation and counter-accusation, alliance and betrayal, as the careful edifice of peace crumbled into civil discord. The royal hunting party had made good progress into the deep forest, following game trails that wound between ancient oaks and through clearings where sunlight filtered down in golden shafts. The king was in excellent spirits, pleased with the day's sport and the company of his brother-in-law, whose skill with bow and spear had provided abundant game for their evening meal. The son of Xanten, for his part, seemed unusually quiet. Something had troubled his sleep the night before, dreams of ice and shadows, of pale eyes watching from the darkness, of debts that remained unpaid. He had woken with a sense of foreboding that the morning's hunt had done little to dispel. "You seem troubled, brother," the king observed as they paused to water their horses at a crystal stream. "Does something weigh upon your mind?" "Perhaps," came the careful reply. "I have been thinking of our recent guests, of alliances built upon foundations that may prove less stable than we hoped." The king's expression grew thoughtful. He too had noticed the undercurrents of tension in his court, the way his queen watched his sister with eyes like winter stars, the careful distance his champion maintained from the man who had once bested him in combat. "Regrets serve no purpose," he said finally. "What's done cannot be undone. We must look forward, not backward." But even as he spoke the words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached their ears. Through the forest came riders in the livery of Burgundy, their leader's scarred face grim with purpose. The champion dismounted and approached with the measured pace of a man who had made his decision and would not be turned from it. In his hand he carried a spear, not a hunting weapon, but something forged for war, its point gleaming with deadly intent. "My lord," he said, offering the king a perfunctory bow, "I bring word from the court. Your queen has urgent need of your immediate return." The lie came easily, delivered with the skill of a man who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of royal politics. But the son of Xanten, enhanced senses alert to danger, caught the subtle tells that revealed the deception, the elevated heartbeat, the slight tension in the muscles, the predatory focus that spoke of a hunter stalking prey. "What manner of urgency?" he asked, his hand drifting instinctively toward his sword hilt. The champion's smile was winter cold, the sort that requires your immediate attention. The attack came without further warning. The war spear flew through the air like a bolt of lightning, its point aimed with deadly precision at the heart of the son of Xanten. But dragon-enhanced reflexes served him well. He threw himself aside at the last instant, the spear passing so close it tore his cloak. "Treachery!" the king shouted, drawing his own sword. "What madness is this?" "No madness, my lord," the champion replied, already drawing his blade. "Justice. Your brother-in-law stands revealed as a fraud, his heroic reputation built upon deception and trickery. Such shame cannot be allowed to stain your honor." The son of Xanten had rolled to his feet, Balmung singing as it cleared its sheath. The legendary sword's appearance drew gasps from the watching men. In the dappled forest light, its blade seemed to burn with its own inner fire. "If you seek justice," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that had not been there before his transformation, "then face me honestly. Let blade meet blade, and see whose cause the gods favor." The champion laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Honestly? You speak of honesty, who won your reputation through invisible trickery. You speak of facing me, who needed supernatural aid to defeat a woman." The accusation stung because it carried truth, and truth had power to wound deeper than any blade. Around them, the hunting party had formed a rough circle, some drawing weapons to defend their king, others hanging back in confusion and uncertainty. "Stand down, all of you," the champion commanded. "This is not your fight. This is between me and the man who has made mockery of everything we hold sacred." The combat that followed was unlike anything the Watchers had ever seen. Two masters of the sword art clashed in a display of skill that blurred the line between martial prowess and deadly dance. Steel rang against steel in patterns too complex for mortal eyes to follow, each warrior seeking the opening that would end the contest. But as the fight progressed, it became clear that something was wrong. The champion, for all his skill and experience, could not land a telling blow. Every thrust was turned aside, every cut deflected, every combination met with responses that seemed to anticipate his attacks before they were fully formed. It was then that understanding dawned in the scarred warrior's pale eyes. This was no mortal opponent he faced, but something transformed, something enhanced beyond human limits. The stories were true. Dragon's blood flowed in those veins, granting strength and speed beyond the reach of ordinary men. But if supernatural power had entered the contest, then perhaps supernatural cunning was required to answer it. Feigning exhaustion, the champion allowed his guard to drop slightly, inviting the attack that would end their duel. The son of Xanten, eager to finish a fight that had already gone on too long, took the bait and lunged forward with Balmung extended in a killing thrust. It was then that the champion revealed his true intention. Instead of trying to parry the legendary blade, he threw himself to one side and grabbed for something he had secreted among his gear, a weapon that sang with its own dark power. This was no ordinary spear, but something forged in the world's youth, specifically to pierce supernatural protection. The spear of destiny found its mark with unerring accuracy, driven by hatred and guided by supernatural malice. It struck the one spot where Dragon's blood offered no protection, the small space between the shoulder blades where a linden leaf had fallen during that fateful transformation. The son of Xanten's scream of agony echoed through the forest, like the cry of a dying god. Balmung fell from nerveless fingers as he collapsed to his knees, the spear transfixing his body, its point emerging from his chest in a welter of crimson. For a moment that stretched like eternity, he knelt there in the dappled sunlight, understanding at last that his story had reached its end. The great adventure that had begun with dragon slaying and treasure winning concluded here, in betrayal by those he had tried to serve. "Why?" he whispered, blood frothing on his lips. The champion stood over him without pity, his scarred face showing no emotion. "Because deception has consequences. Because honor demands satisfaction. Because some lies are too great to be borne." With that, he twisted the spear, ensuring that the wound would prove mortal. The hero's life ebbed away, like wine spilling from a broken cup, his dragon-enhanced vitality finally proving insufficient against a weapon forged specifically for such purpose. As death took him, the son of Xanten's last thought was of his beloved princess, of the joy they had shared, and the price that joy had ultimately demanded. He hoped she would understand, hoped she would forgive him for the deception that had brought them together and the consequences that deception had finally earned. The champion stood over the body for a long moment, then bent to retrieve the spear that had ended a legend. When he spoke, his voice carried the finality of a death sentence fulfilled. "It is finished," he said simply. "Justice has been served." But as he spoke those words, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the forest air. Somewhere in the distance, ravens began to call, black birds that fed on carrion and were said to be the messengers of the old gods. Their cries seemed almost like laughter, dark and knowing, as if they understood that this death was not an ending, but a beginning. The wheel of fate had turned once more, and the consequences of this moment would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, touching lives and kingdoms in ways that none of them could foresee. The greatest hero of his age was dead, struck down by treachery in the flower of his youth. But his story and the curse of the treasure he had won would live on to claim other victims, to spread its poison through the halls of kings, until kingdoms fell and legends were born from the ashes of the destroyed. The champion had won his justice, but at a price that would ultimately prove greater than any of them could imagine. The scream that shattered the morning air above Worms could have woken the dead. It came from the royal chambers, where servants had found the princess collapsed over a blood-soaked cloak, all that remained of her beloved husband, save for his sword, which the champion had brought back as proof of the deed's completion. Balmung lay silent now, its legendary voice stilled, its blade dark with the blood of the man who had wielded it with such skill. For 3 days and 3 nights, she wailed her grief to the uncaring heavens. Her golden hair, once her pride, she tore from her head in handfuls. Her beautiful gowns she rent to rags, clothing herself instead in the black of deepest mourning. Food and drink she refused, as if she could starve herself into the grave to join her beloved in whatever realm awaits the dead. The funeral was a spectacle of magnificent hypocrisy. All the great nobles of Burgundy attended, dressed in their finest mourning garb, their faces masks of practiced sorrow. They spoke of the deceased's valor, his service to the crown, his tragic end at the hands of bandits in the deep forest. For that was the story the court had agreed upon, the lie that would preserve what remained of royal dignity. Only a few knew the truth, that the greatest hero of his age had died not fighting brigands, but pierced by a spear thrown by the king's own champion. That his death had been orchestrated by the Ice Queen's thirst for vengeance, executed by the scarred warrior's notion of justice. Queen Brunhild attended the ceremony with perfect composure, her beautiful face showing appropriate sorrow for the loss of a brave knight. She spoke words of comfort to the grieving widow, offered the consolation of one royal lady to another. To all appearances, she was the very model of sisterly compassion. But those who looked closely might have noticed the satisfaction that gleamed in her pale blue eyes, the slight curve of her lips that suggested a hunger finally sated. The widow herself was beyond such observations. Grief had transformed her as surely as dragon's blood had transformed her husband. Where once she had been radiant with joy, now she blazed with anguish. Where once her laughter had filled halls with music, now her sobs echoed through chambers like the wailing of the damned. But grief, like fire, can forge as well as destroy. As the months passed and the initial shock of loss began to fade, something harder began to emerge from the ashes of her sorrow. The realization that her husband's death had been no accident, no random act of brigandage, but a carefully orchestrated murder designed to satisfy the Ice Queen's wounded pride. The truth came to her in fragments, whispered by servants who had overheard conversations, revealed by nobles who let slip details they should have kept hidden. Piece by piece, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. How Queen Brunhild had demanded satisfaction for the deception in Iceland. How the champion had accepted the task of blood payment. How her beloved had been lured to his death by those he trusted most. Knowledge brought with it a thirst for retribution that grew stronger with each passing day. The question of the treasure arose within weeks of the funeral. The vast hoard that her husband had won from the dragon's lair, gold and gems beyond counting, artifacts of power that could reshape kingdoms, had been his by right of conquest, and by marriage law it now belonged to his widow. But the king and his brothers had other ideas. Such wealth should not rest in the hands of a grieving woman, they declared in council. It should serve the realm, should be used to strengthen our defenses and expand our influence. Surely our sister understands the necessity. But the widow understood something else entirely, that the treasure was power, and power was the only thing that could purchase the vengeance she craved. "The gold stays with me," she declared, her voice carrying an authority that had not been there in her days of innocent happiness. "It was won by my husband's blood and courage. It will remain mine until I choose otherwise." The confrontation that followed revealed the true balance of forces within the kingdom. The royal brothers commanded armies, controlled territories, held the loyalty of the great nobles. But the widow possessed something that made kings nervous. Wealth enough to buy the allegiance of anyone who could be bought, influence that transcended the normal channels of power. For a time, an uneasy truce prevailed. The widow kept her treasure, while the royal brothers kept their authority. But underneath the surface, both sides maneuvered for advantage, seeking the moment when the balance might shift decisively. It was the champion who broke the stalemate. The scarred warrior had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the widow's presence at court. Every time he saw her, he was reminded of the deed he had done, the blood he had spilled in service to his notion of honor. Her very existence was an accusation, a reminder that his victory had been purchased with treachery. Worse still, he had begun to suspect that she knew the truth of her husband's death. The way she looked at him when she thought herself unobserved, the questions she asked about that fateful hunting trip, the careful distance she maintained from all those who had been involved. It all pointed to a dangerous level of knowledge. "The treasure is a threat to the realm's stability," he counseled the king in private. "As long as she controls such wealth, she poses a danger to the crown. Better to move decisively while we still hold the advantage." The plan they devised was simple in its elegance. Under cover of darkness, while the widow slept in her chambers, teams of the most trusted men would remove the treasure from its hiding places. It would be transported in secret to a location known only to the king and his most loyal followers, there to remain until such time as it could be safely dealt with. But when they came for the gold, they found the hiding places empty. The widow had anticipated their move, had spent weeks quietly relocating her wealth to a dozen different caches throughout the city. By the time the royal soldiers arrived to claim their prize, every coin, every gem, every artifact of power had vanished into the night. "Where?" the king demanded when he confronted his sister the next morning. "Where have you hidden what rightfully belongs to the crown?" Her smile was winter sharp, holding echoes of the Ice Queen who had taught her the true nature of power. "Safe," she replied simply. "Safer than it would be in the hands of those who murdered the man who won it." The accusation hung in the air like a sword blade. its edge sharp enough to cut through all pretense and diplomacy. In that moment, brother and sister understood that the bonds of blood and affection that had once united them were broken beyond any hope of repair. "You have no proof of such wild claims," the king said carefully. "Don't I?" she asked, her voice carrying a certainty that made strong men nervous. "Shall we discuss the details of that hunting trip? Shall we examine the weapon that supposedly killed my husband? Shall we speak of conversations overheard and agreements made in shadow?" The threat was explicit. She knew enough to destroy them all, to reveal the conspiracy that had ended her husband's life. But she was offering a bargain: silence in exchange for the treasure's security. It was then that the champion played his final card. "The gold is cursed," he announced to the assembled court. "It carries within it the doom of all who possess it, the legacy of the dragon that died to defend it. As long as it remains in mortal hands, it will bring nothing but sorrow and destruction." The claim was not entirely false. The hoard did indeed carry a curse, as the ghostly Nibelung brothers had warned. But the champion's true purpose was not to protect the realm from supernatural danger. It was to remove the source of the widow's power before she could use it against them. Under cover of this righteous justification, he led a force of picked men to the Rhine's banks. There, in the deepest part of the river, where the current ran swift and dark, they consigned the treasure to the depths. Cartload after cartload of gold and gems disappeared beneath the grey waters, along with artifacts of power that had shaped the destiny of heroes. The widow watched from the castle walls as her birthright sank beneath the waves. Each splash was like a dagger to her heart, each lost piece a reminder of how thoroughly she had been outmaneuvered. When the last of the treasure vanished into the river's depths, she felt the final connection to her former life severed. The gold was gone, but not forgotten. Somewhere beneath the Rhine's dark waters, the Nibelung horde waited with the patience of ages, its curse intact, its power undiminished. The champion had thought to end its influence by hiding it from mortal reach, but he had succeeded only in ensuring that its legacy would endure long after all present had returned to dust. For the widow, the loss of the treasure marked not an ending, but a transformation. Stripped of her wealth, isolated from her family, surrounded by those who had conspired in her beloved's murder, she might have despaired. A lesser woman might have accepted defeat, might have retreated into the shadows to nurse her grief in silence. But the princess who had once been filled with innocent joy was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The woman who remained had been forged in the fires of loss and tempered by the cold waters of betrayal. She understood now that power took many forms, that influence could be purchased with more than gold. The offer, when it came, seemed like a gift from the gods themselves. King Etzel of the Huns, Attila to those who knew his name in Latin, was in need of a new wife. His previous queen had died in childbirth, leaving him with a kingdom to rule and no suitable consort to share the burden. His ambassadors had been sent throughout the known world, seeking a woman of appropriate station who might serve both as bride and political ally. When they learned of the widowed Princess of Burgundy, their interest was immediate and intense. Here was a woman of royal blood, proven fertility, and, most importantly, reason to seek alliance against her own family. The political possibilities were intoxicating. The proposal arrived with great ceremony, accompanied by gifts that spoke of the Hun king's vast wealth and power. Silks from distant Cathay, gems from mines beyond the edge of the world, weapons forged by masters whose names were legend among the Eastern peoples. The message was clear. This was no desperate widower seeking comfort. but a great king, offering to share his throne with one worthy of such honor. The court of Burgundy received the proposal with mixed emotions. On one hand, such an alliance could prove valuable, connecting them to the greatest military power in the known world. On the other hand, the prospect of their sister ruling over the very people they might one day face in battle was deeply troubling. But the widow herself saw possibilities that transcended simple politics. Etzel commanded armies that could sweep across Europe like a plague of locusts. His warriors were hardened by constant warfare, loyal unto death and utterly without mercy when their king commanded them to kill. Under his protection, she would be safe from her brother's scheming, beyond the reach of the champion's blade. More importantly, from the steppes of Hungary, she could plan the vengeance that consumed her waking thoughts and haunted her dreams. "I accept," she announced, her decision stunning the court with its swiftness and finality. "Sister," the king began, "surely you wish time to consider." "I have considered," she cut him off, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "I will be queen of the Huns, and through that union, new possibilities will be born." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Those who had destroyed her happiness would learn the true meaning of retribution, would discover that some wounds never heal and some debts can never be forgiven. As preparations began for her departure, the widow found herself visited by an unexpected guest. Queen Brunhild came to her chambers as the sun set over the Rhine, her pale beauty unmarked by the years, her manner as cold and regal as ever. "So," the Ice Queen said, settling into a chair with fluid grace, "you flee to the barbarians in the east. How appropriate." "I do not flee," the widow replied, her voice steady despite the fury that burned in her chest. "I advance to a new battlefield, one where the rules favor different strategies." "And what strategies might those be?" Brunhild asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Patient ones," came the reply. "Thorough ones. Strategies that ensure all debts are paid in full, with interest compounded over time." The two women regarded each other across the chamber, like generals studying a map before battle. Each understood that this conversation was more than simple farewell. It was the formal declaration of a war that would not end until one of them lay dead. "I look forward to seeing what the eastern winds might blow back to us," Queen Brunhild said as she rose to leave, "though I suspect Burgundy has weathered fiercer storms than any barbarian queen might summon." "We shall see," the widow replied. "Time, as they say, reveals all truths." After the Ice Queen departed, the widow stood at her window, watching the Rhine flow past the castle walls. Somewhere beneath those dark waters lay the treasure that should have been her inheritance, the gold that could have purchased the destruction of her enemies. But perhaps there were forms of power more valuable than mere wealth, alliances more deadly than any hoard of cursed gold. The Huns were coming to escort her to her new home, to the court of a king whose very name made civilized men tremble. There, among the felt tents and horse lords of the steppes, she would learn new ways of war, new methods of vengeance. And when the time was right, when the moment was perfect, she would invite her beloved brothers to visit her in her new kingdom. She would offer them the hospitality due to family, the welcome appropriate to honored guests. It would be a reunion they would never forget, assuming any of them survived to remember it. The wheel of fate continued its inexorable turn, carrying them all toward a reckoning that would shake the foundations of the known world. The widow had lost a husband, lost a treasure, lost everything that had once given her life meaning. But in losing everything, she had gained something far more dangerous: the absolute clarity of purpose that comes only to those who have nothing left to lose. 13 years had passed since the widow became queen of the Huns. 13 years of learning the ways of the steppes, of mastering the harsh tongues of the eastern peoples, of bearing sons to a king whose love had grown genuine despite the political nature of their union. King Etzel doted upon his new wife, marveling at her beauty and intelligence, never suspecting that beneath her gracious exterior burned a hatred that time had only refined to perfect clarity. The court of the Huns was unlike anything the former princess had ever imagined. Where Burgundy was stone and ceremony, the Hun kingdom was leather and movement, its power flowing like a river across the vast grasslands. Warriors who had ridden from the edges of China sat beside nobles whose ancestors had sacked Rome, all united in their loyalty to the king who had welded a dozen tribes into the mightiest force the world had ever seen. But it was not conquest that occupied the queen's thoughts as she grew into her power. It was invitation. The message, when it finally came, was a masterpiece of diplomatic craft. Written on the finest parchment, sealed with gold, carried by ambassadors whose rich gifts spoke of the sender's prosperity and goodwill. It was everything a royal invitation should be. "Our beloved brothers," it began, "too long have we been separated by the vast distances between our realms. Our heart yearns to see once more the faces of family, to share with our dear husband the company of those who knew us in our youth. Therefore, we extend this invitation to visit our court, that we might celebrate together the bonds of blood that unite us despite the leagues that divide us." The letter spoke of feasts and festivals, of contests and celebrations, of the joy that would accompany such a reunion. It made no mention of the deaths that had driven the writer from her homeland, no reference to the betrayals that had shaped her transformation from innocent princess to barbarian queen. In the great hall of worms, the royal brothers read the invitation with mixed emotions. "She seems reconciled," Jerno observed, studying the elegant script. "Perhaps time has softened the grief that once consumed her." "Perhaps," the king agreed, though his voice carried undertones of uncertainty. "Yet I find myself wondering what manner of woman our sister has become in the years since her departure. The Hun court is not known for gentleness. It was the champion who voiced the suspicion that gnawed at them all. This smells of trap," he said bluntly, his scarred face grim with foreboding. "She knows the truth of her husband's death, knows the role each of us played in that affair. Such knowledge does not fade with time, it festers." "You counsel refusing her invitation?" Gisela asked. "She is our sister, whatever changes the years may have wrought. To reject her overture would be to insult not only her, but her husband's court." "Better insult than death," the champion replied grimly. "I have seen enough of royal vengeance to know its signs. This invitation is not about reconciliation, it is about retribution." But the king found himself caught between competing pressures. To refuse would indeed be seen as an insult to Etzel's court, potentially making an enemy of the greatest military power in the known world. To accept might be to walk into a trap, but it might also be an opportunity to heal old wounds and forge new alliances. The decision, when it came, was influenced by factors beyond mere family sentiment. Reports had been reaching Burgundy of unrest along their eastern borders, of raids and incursions that bore the mark of organized military action. Some whispered that these were tests, probes designed to gauge the kingdom's defenses. Others suggested they were messages, reminders of the vast armies that lay just beyond the horizon. Perhaps, the king mused, This invitation represents an opportunity to address these concerns directly. Face to face, ruler to ruler, we might resolve whatever tensions exist between our realms. It was a rational decision, born of political necessity and royal pragmatism. It was also, as events would prove, the most catastrophic mistake in the history of the Burgundian kingdom. The journey east took them through lands that grew stranger and more ominous with each passing league. The neat farms and ordered towns of the Rhine valley gave way to darker forests, to mountains where ancient gods still held sway, to plains where the very air tasted of distant wars and approaching doom. The Burgundian party travelled in state befitting their rank, 300 knights in burnished mail, wagons laden with gifts for their hosts, banners flying the proud device of the Red Boar. They looked like what they were, a royal embassy travelling to visit allied rulers, confident in their strength and secure in their purpose. But those who watched the column's progress might have noticed how the men's laughter grew forced as they travelled deeper into Hun territory, how their songs died away as the familiar landscape gave way to alien vistas, how their hands moved instinctively to weapon hilts when the wind brought sounds from the empty steppes. The first warning came from a most unexpected source. At a river crossing deep in the borderlands, they encountered a group of women washing clothes in the swift-running water. But these were no ordinary washerwomen. They were the Norns, the three sisters who spun the threads of fate itself, and their presence at such a place and time could mean only one thing. "Turn back," the eldest sister called to them, her voice carrying clearly across the water. "What you seek lies not ahead but behind. The path you follow leads only to the grave. Death awaits in the hall where you are bound," added the second sister, her eyes reflecting depths that had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms. "The feast prepared for you will be seasoned with your own blood." The youngest sister said nothing, but she held up the thread she was spinning, black as midnight, sharp as a sword blade, and so thin it seemed to cut the very air. When she pulled it taut between her hands, it snapped with a sound like breaking bones. The Burgundian nobles looked to their king for guidance, but he had already spurred his horse toward the ford. "Prophecies are for poets and madmen," he declared. "We are neither." Yet as they crossed the river, more than one warrior felt a chill that had nothing to do with the water's temperature. Behind them, the three sisters resumed their washing. But now the garments they cleaned were stained with blood that would not fade, marked with tears that would never heal. The Hun capital rose from the steppes like a vision from another world. Vast as a city, but built to move like an army. It sprawled across the grasslands in patterns that seemed to shift and flow with the wind. Felt pavilions the size of castles housed the households of great lords, while smaller tents spread outward like ripples from stones thrown into still water. At the center of it all stood the Great Hall, a structure that dwarfed even the mightiest buildings of the West. Built from the timber of entire forests, roofed with gold taken from a dozen conquered kingdoms, decorated with banners that bore the devices of nations that no longer existed, it was a monument to the irresistible power of the Hun war machine. The welcome they received was magnificent beyond description. Trumpets blared the traditional fanfares of hospitality, while ranks of warriors in silk and steel formed honor guards along their route. The very greatest nobles of the Eastern realm had turned out to greet them, their rich garments and exotic weapons, speaking of the vast wealth that flowed to the Hun court from the ends of the earth. And at the center of it all, radiant in cloth of gold and crowned with jewels that captured the light of the setting sun, stood the queen they had come so far to see. 13 years had transformed her as surely as dragon's blood had once transformed her husband. Where once there had been innocent joy, now there was sophisticated beauty. Where once there had been gentle laughter, now there was regal composure. She moved with the fluid grace of one accustomed to absolute power, spoke with the authority of one whose words could unleash armies. "My beloved brothers," she said as they dismounted before the great hall, "welcome to my husband's court. Too long have we been separated by distance and duty. Now we are reunited, and our joy knows no bounds." The embrace she gave each brother was warm, genuine in its apparent affection. The tears that glittered in her eyes seemed real enough, the tremor in her voice suggesting emotion too deep for words. To all appearances, this was indeed a sister's heartfelt welcome, a reunion that promised to heal old wounds and forge new bonds. But the champion, watching from his place among the knights, caught something the others missed, a glitter in those blue eyes that had nothing to do with tears, a tension in her posture that spoke of coiled springs waiting to be released. The feast that followed was a spectacle that beggared description. The great hall had been transformed into something from legend, its vast interior lit by 1,000 torches, its walls hung with tapestries that told the stories of a dozen conquered peoples. Long tables groaned under the weight of delicacies from across the known world, while wine flowed from amphora, marked with the seals of vineyards that stretched from Gaul to Cathay. King Etzel presided over the celebration with the benevolent air of a man secure in his power and content in his achievements. He welcomed his wife's brothers with genuine warmth, speaking at length of the bonds that now united their realms, of the friendship that transcended the differences between their peoples. "Too long," he declared, raising his cup in toast, "have East and West been divided by suspicion and misunderstanding. Tonight we celebrate not just reunion, but the beginning of a new age of cooperation and peace." The Burgundian nobles drank to the toast, their spirits lifted by the magnificent hospitality and their host's evident sincerity. Here was no barbarian warlord thirsting for conquest, but a civilized ruler seeking alliance and understanding. Only gradually did they begin to notice the subtle wrongness that pervaded the celebration. The Hun warriors, who served as guards, stood too close to the high table, their hands never far from their weapon hilts. The doors to the great hall, though standing open in apparent welcome, were guarded by men whose eyes never left the Burgundian party. The very servants who filled their cups and served their food moved with the disciplined precision of soldiers rather than domestic staff. It was when the evening's entertainment began that the true nature of their situation became clear. The first performer was a skald from the far north, whose songs told of heroes who had fallen in battle, of kings who had met their doom through treachery, of the ravens that fed on the flesh of the proud. His voice was beautiful, his skill undeniable, but the themes of his ballads cast a shadow over the celebration that no amount of wine could dispel. Next came dancers from the eastern provinces, their movements telling stories of conquest and submission, of cities burned and peoples enslaved. Their silk costumes were stained with what might have been wine, but looked disturbingly like blood, their faces painted with designs that suggested skulls and funeral shrouds. But it was the final entertainment that revealed the evening's true purpose. A single figure stepped into the center of the hall, a young man whose golden hair and noble bearing marked him unmistakably as royal blood. This was the Queen's son by King Etzel, a child who bore the features of both parents, but whose eyes held depths that suggested knowledge beyond his years. "My lords," the boy said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall, "my mother has asked me to share with you a tale of heroism and betrayal, of love destroyed by treachery, of justice too long delayed." The story he told was familiar to every person present, though none had ever heard it related with such devastating precision. He spoke of a young hero who had won impossible victories through supernatural aid, of a marriage built upon deception, of a murder disguised as justice. Each detail was accurate, each revelation calculated to wound, each word chosen to strip away the pretenses that had allowed the Burgundians to live with their guilt. As the tale unfolded, the great hall grew colder, despite the blazing torches. The Hun nobles listened with expressions of growing outrage, while their hands moved to weapon hilts with increasing frequency. The Burgundian party found themselves the focus of hostile stares, surrounded by warriors whose patience was wearing visibly thin. When the boy finished his recitation, silence fell like a burial shroud. It was broken by the queen herself, who rose from her throne with fluid grace and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the vast hall. "Justice," she said simply, "has been too long delayed. But tonight, at last, all debts will be paid in full." The signal she gave was subtle, a single gesture that might have been mistaken for a wave of acknowledgement, but the Hun warriors recognized it for what it was, and their response was swift and deadly. The doors to the great hall slammed shut with sounds like thunder. Armed men poured from concealed passages, their weapons already drawn, their faces grim with purpose. In the space of heartbeats, the Burgundian party found themselves surrounded by a forest of spear points and sword edges. "Treachery!" the champion roared, his blade singing as it cleared its sheath. Around him, his comrades followed suit, their weapons forming a rough circle as they prepared to sell their lives dearly. "Not treachery," the queen corrected, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. "Justice, long delayed, carefully planned, perfectly executed justice." The battle that followed was unlike anything the great hall had ever witnessed. 300 Burgundian knights, the finest warriors their kingdom could produce, faced against the massed might of the Hun army. It should have been a massacre, a brief and bloody conclusion to a carefully orchestrated trap. But the men of Burgundy were not mere courtiers dressed in armor for ceremony. They were veterans of a dozen campaigns, warriors who had earned their places through skill and courage, knights who would rather die fighting than live in dishonor. When the attack came, they met it with a ferocity that surprised even their enemies. The champion carved a path of destruction through the Hun ranks, his blade taking lives with every stroke. Jerno and Gisela fought back to back, their swords weaving patterns of death that held an entire section of the hall. Even the king, despite his years and the weight of kingship, proved that he had not forgotten the warrior's skills that had won his crown. But courage and skill could not overcome the odds they faced. For every Hun who fell, 2 more took his place. For every yard they won, they lost 2 more. The great hall became a slaughterhouse, its floor slick with blood, its walls echoing with the screams of the dying. It was then that fire joined the fray. Whether by accident or design, the torches that lit the hall began to ignite the tapestries and decorations. Flames spread with terrifying speed, turning the enclosed space into a furnace that threatened to consume everyone within its walls. The very air became an enemy, thick with smoke that burned the lungs and confused the mind. In the growing inferno, the battle took on an apocalyptic quality. Warriors fought through walls of flame, their armor heating until it glowed like coals, their weapons becoming too hot to hold. The smoke grew so thick that friend and foe became indistinguishable, leading to savage melees where men struck blindly at anything that moved. One by one, the Burgundian heroes fell. Gernot died with his back to a pillar, surrounded by the bodies of the enemies he had slain, his sword still in his hand, even as his life ebbed away. Giselair fell defending a group of younger knights, his body pierced by a dozen spears, but his spirit unbroken even in death. Through it all, the queen watched from her throne, her beautiful face illuminated by the flames, her eyes reflecting the fires that consumed her enemies. This was the moment she had planned for 13 years, the culmination of a patience that had outlasted kingdoms. To see her husband's murderers dying in agony was sweeter than any wine, more satisfying than any feast. But it was the final confrontation that provided the greatest satisfaction. The king and his champion, the last survivors of their party, stood at bay in the center of the burning hall. Around them lay the bodies of their men, the finest knights of Burgundy reduced to corpses in a foreign land. Smoke and flame surrounded them, while the surviving Hun warriors formed a closing circle of death. "Yield," the queen called to them, her voice carrying clearly through the chaos. "Surrender, and your deaths will be swift and merciful." The champion's response was to spit in the flames that licked at his feet. "We are knights of Burgundy. We do not yield to barbarians and murderers." "Murderers?" The queen's laugh was like breaking glass. "You speak of murder, who drove a spear through my husband's back. You lecture me on honor, who engineered his death to satisfy your twisted notion of justice." It was then that King Etzel himself entered the fray, his face black with soot and grief. In his arms he carried the body of his son, the golden-haired boy who had recited the tale of treachery, now dead from a Burgundian blade. His young life ended in the savage fighting. "You have killed my child," the Hun king said, his voice breaking with anguish. "My innocent son, who had done you no harm, who spoke only the truth his mother taught him." The accusations struck home with devastating force. In their desperate fight for survival, the Burgundians had indeed struck down the boy, their blades making no distinction between warrior and child in the chaos of battle. But it was the queen who delivered the killing blow, not with a weapon, but with words that cut deeper than any steel. "Tell me," she said to the champion, her voice soft as silk and sharp as winter, "where lies the treasure you stole from me? Where rests the gold my husband won with his blood? The hoard you consigned to the river's depths rather than see it remain in my hands?" The scarred warrior's face went pale, despite the flames that surrounded him. Here was the one secret that could not be revealed, the one piece of knowledge that must die with him. "I will carry that secret to my grave," he said. "Yes," the queen agreed, drawing her husband's own sword from its sheath. "You will." The blade that ended the champion's life was neither Hun nor Burgundian, but something older and more terrible, a weapon forged in the world's youth, when gods walked among men and queens commanded powers that made kings tremble. It clove through armor as if it were paper, through flesh as if it were mist, ending the life of the man who had served his kingdom so faithfully and so terribly. The king survived his champion by mere moments, overwhelmed by Hun warriors who showed no mercy to the man who had cost them so much blood. When he fell, the last light of Burgundian resistance was extinguished, the final echo of their proud defiance silenced forever. In the burning ruins of the great hall, surrounded by the bodies of enemies and innocents alike, the queen stood triumphant at last. 13 years of patient planning had culminated in this moment of perfect vengeance. The men who had destroyed her happiness lay dead at her feet. their blood seeping into the earth as payment for the debt they had owed. But even as she savoured her victory, she felt a hand seize her arm. One of Etzel's oldest warriors, a man who had served the Hun court since before her arrival, looked upon her with eyes full of horror and disgust. "This is not justice," he said, his voice heavy with condemnation. "This is butchery. You have turned hospitality into slaughter, made murderers of us all. Such deeds stain the honor of every man who calls himself Hun." The blade that pierced her heart was almost a mercy, ending the life of a woman who had achieved everything she had ever wanted and found it to be ashes in.